By the late 16th century, England effectively maintained a standing army. From the 1580s until the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, English companies served abroad without interruption. Sometimes the Crown raised troops for foreign service in large numbers, while at other times thousands of individuals volunteered on their own, crossing the Channel to fight in continental wars. These volunteers are often overlooked, since the surviving records that reveal their names, ages, destinations, and commanders remain scattered or unpublished. The main reservoirs of English military manpower were the garrisons in the Netherlands and the permanent establishments in Ireland. From there, soldiers could be shifted to other fronts where England's interests were at stake, in Brittany, Normandy, or even Iberia. Like the Crown's supply system, this army was multi-layered, official when directed from London, private when men served at their own expense, and in some sense, foreign, since they usually fought alongside Protestant allies on the continent. This arrangement helped soften the political risks at home, since Parliament and the English public were wary of a permanent army, and Catholic powers often bristled at overt English intervention. By framing military actions as joint Protestant ventures, Elizabeth's government found a way to justify and sustain campaigns abroad. The defense of Sluys in the summer of 1587 put English military reputation to the test. A garrison of just 1,600 Anglo-Dutch troops faced the Duke of Parma, who brought 6,000 of Philip II's best soldiers. For 18 days and nights, the defenders fought hand-to-hand at the breaches, countered mines with countermines, and carried out desperate sorties. Among them were future luminaries, Francis Vere, Roger Williams, and Thomas Baskerville, easily recognizable by their colorful plumes and armor. Parma eventually forced a surrender on the 5th of August, but not before suffering more casualties than in several of his previous campaigns combined. He openly praised his English opponents, singling out Baskerville for his skill and bravery. Though Sluys fell, it was clear that English troops had earned the respect of one of Europe's greatest generals. The Dutch continued to value English arms. In 1589, when Maurice of Nassau faced Count Mansfeld's 11,000-strong Catholic army, 600 of his 1,500 defenders were English. In siege after siege through the 1590s, English companies became central to Protestant strategy. Maurice himself trusted them with critical missions and placed them in positions of honor. Plans for a surprise assault on Dunkirk in 1591, for example, were kept secret even from most of his advisors, but English captains like Robert Sidney and Francis Vere were fully in the loop. When the attack force was selected, the English formed the vanguard. Elizabeth's soldiers were so vital that Dutch leaders protested whenever the Queen considered withdrawing them. Even talk of sending veterans to fight in Brittany alarmed the States General, who feared their loss would sap morale and weaken support for the war. Diplomats like Thomas Bodley confirmed that if English companies were removed, the Dutch would be forced onto the defensive. The capture of fortresses like Zutphen and Deventer in the early 1590s highlighted again that English troops were often chosen to lead the hardest and most dangerous assaults, and they delivered results. Still, the cost to the Crown was enormous. Sir John Norris, one of Elizabeth's most seasoned commanders, reported that by early 1588, the Queen had spent over £800,000 in just 2 years on the war in the Netherlands. A staggering figure, inflated perhaps, but not entirely misleading. Even cautious estimates placed the annual expense at more than £125,000, far above the crown's normal revenues. Elizabeth never forgot that every victory came at the price of her strained treasury, and this tension between military necessity and financial reality haunted her foreign policy for the rest of her reign. Elizabeth I lived of her own on ordinary revenues of about £250,000 a year. Before the Spanish War, her government usually spent around £168,000 annually. War changed everything. By mid-1588, the treasury was nearly drained despite new parliamentary subsidies and emergency loans from the city. The Armada had been beaten back, but Philip II remained wealthy, and his troops in Flanders posed a continuing threat. England, by contrast, had spent staggering sums to survive. The chaotic muster of 1588 had left courtiers and commanders alike uneasy. Defensive planning still dominated English strategy, yet many urged that the moment of Spanish weakness should be turned to England's advantage. Some proposed an invasion of Portugal to stir rebellion and carry the fight directly onto Philip's soil. The expedition of 1589 was conceived as a combined naval and land operation, echoing Henry VIII's campaigns a century earlier. Troops in the Netherlands would be shipped to Iberia, funded partly by Parliament, partly by the Dutch, but largely by a group of adventurers, private investors who expected plunder from Lisbon, Seville, or the Azores. Elizabeth herself contributed nearly £50,000, but she wanted Spanish ships destroyed first and booty taken second. Her commanders, John Norris, Francis Drake, and the young Earl of Essex, thought the other way around. That mismatch of priorities doomed the campaign before it began. The force struck first at Corunna, wrongly assuming treasure galleons were in the harbor. In fact, the richest prizes were safe at Santander, the very target the Queen had wanted attacked. Still, the landing showed English efficiency. 7,000 men disembarked in 3 hours. They quickly took the lower town, seized stores of food, weapons, 150 brass cannon, and even 6,000 pipes of wine, which many soldiers sampled with more enthusiasm than discipline. Local militia counterattacked, but were beaten back, showing how sluggish Iberian home forces had become. The real challenge was the castle and upper town. With too little artillery, mining operations mishandled, and no support from the idle fleet, repeated assaults failed. A collapsing tower buried men in the breach, killing or maiming dozens. On the 6th of May, a Spanish relief force of nearly 10,000 tried to drive the English back. Norris gathered 7,000 men and launched a bold counterattack at a narrow stone bridge. The English stormed across, routing the camp and killing hundreds at the cost of only a handful of casualties. Officers, however, paid the price. Captain Fulford wounded, Captain Barton half blinded, and Sir Edward Norris nearly killed until his brother hacked through enemy lines to save him. Sir John Norris himself fought without armor, throwing himself recklessly into the melee. The Corunna campaign captured both the strength and weakness of Elizabethan warfare. Soldiers showed courage and adaptability, and officers led from the very front. Yet their eagerness for honor often drew men into unnecessary fights, and the lack of strategic coherence squandered opportunities. The Queen, watching from afar, knew her captain's bravery was real, but so too was their tendency to let glory outweigh good sense. After the disappointment at Corunna, the commanders made an even greater mistake. Instead of striking Santander, where Philip II's fleet could have been crippled, they sailed for Lisbon. The English fleet reached the Tagus River on the 15th of May, 1589, joined by 2 striking figures, the seasoned Sir Roger Williams and the ambitious young Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Essex, eager to prove himself, was the first man to wade ashore through the surf, fighting hand-to-hand with a Spaniard and reportedly killing him. A story that surely reached Elizabeth with mixed pride and alarm. Around 6,000 English soldiers disembarked at Peniche and began their march towards Lisbon, expecting Portuguese rebels to rally to their side. None came. Instead, their camp was twice infiltrated by enemy troops disguised as friendly locals, leaving officers and men dead. On 23rd May, Sir John Norris led his troops into Lisbon's suburbs, only to find himself in the same trap as at Corunna, facing fortified positions without heavy artillery. Reduced to 4,000 effective soldiers, cut off from Drake at sea, and with little local support, the English could do little more than burn enemy supplies. They claimed this as a success, but Whitehall was not convinced. The real Spanish fleet remained untouched at Santander, and the Lisbon mission ended with nothing but wasted strength. A final attempt to strike the Azores was broken by storms, and the battered force limped back to England. The tragedy was clear. The venture, driven by investors seeking plunder, had failed in its strategic purpose. Spanish ships survived, were repaired, and lived to menace English waters well into the next decade. By autumn 1589, the war widened. Henry of Navarre desperately needed help, and Elizabeth, though weary of expense, could not ignore him. With Norris and Drake discredited after Portugal, the Queen turned to Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby. His reputation had been clouded by disputes with the Dutch, but Elizabeth entrusted him with leading a new force. True to Elizabeth's caution, the men selected were not raw levies. Trained bands from Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, and London were ordered overseas, including pikemen and musketeers already drilled by local captains. Some saw it as a chance to learn the art of war while defending the Protestant cause. In all, about 3,600 men sailed under Willoughby. The government, straining under the costs of continuous war, still managed to provide them with equipment, pay, and supplies. Yet the financial burden was immense. To fund the expedition and meet other commitments, Elizabeth's ministers had to sell crown lands and scramble for cash. Payments ranged from wages for soldiers and the building of fire ships to the maintenance of garrisons in Ireland, Berwick, and Portsmouth. The tally was staggering: tens of thousands of pounds for fleets, fortifications, and foreign allies. Every coin spent underscored the reality. Elizabeth's England was locked in a struggle that touched every shore, and conserving resources was as vital as courage on the battlefield. By the time the 1590s began, England was already well on the path toward becoming a militarized state, and Elizabeth's soldiers shared in the hardships of their queen. Many were ruined financially by their service. Sir Thomas Wilsford, one of the proud Kentish men who marched with Lord Willoughby, was heavily in debt even before the campaign began. Willoughby himself returned from France exhausted, both in body and fortune, and fewer than 1,000 of his men made it back alive. Yet despite the misery, there was a sense of purpose. John Stubbs, the mustermaster who intended to re-enlist with the French Protestant army but died before doing so, summed up the spirit with the words, "The king's cause is God's cause." To many, the suffering was worth it if they could claim the honor of having taken part in the struggle. The reality, however, was grim. More English lives were lost to hunger, exhaustion, and bad rations than to enemy fire. Still, the presence of Elizabeth's troops gave Henry IV's campaigns real strength. Contemporary accounts even claimed that towns surrendered because they feared the English more than the French. Whether or not that was true, their record in siege warfare spoke for itself. At Vendôme in 1590, they forced their way across rivers and ditches, while at Le Mans, they improvised amphibious rafts from barrels and ladders. At Alençon, they used a hooked device to pull down a drawbridge. These feats showed ingenuity and courage, even if Henry often lacked the money and supplies to keep them in the field. Elizabeth's men had proven their value, but their sacrifices did not always translate into lasting strategic gain. What was remarkable was not just their performance, but that Elizabeth managed to sustain the Protestant cause at all, given the crushing costs of war in 1588, 1589, and 1590. By the autumn of 1591, her commanders, veterans of Portugal such as Norris, Williams, and Wingfield, had already drawn over £28,000 for the Brittany campaign. The Queen herself calculated that between 1587 and 1591, she had spent the equivalent of nearly £345,000 supporting Henry IV, financing German mercenaries, Willoughby's force, Essex's Normandy expedition, the Brittany army, and operations at Brest. England's soldiers had become indispensable, and Elizabeth, their tireless. For many of the officers, honor remained the strongest motivation. Their high casualty rate reflected a willingness to lead from the front, to win glory even when strategy faltered. The wars of this era were marked not so much by decisive battles as by endless maneuver, sieges, and defensive campaigns. Commanders often avoided a full-scale clash, knowing how uncertain battle could be. As one veteran observed, nothing under the moon was so uncertain as battle. Fate, chance, and fortune still hung over the battlefield, leaving soldiers to wonder whether survival came from skill and bravery or from forces beyond human control. For commanders like the Duke of Parma, steeped in Roman models of strategy, warfare was above all a matter of logistics and maneuver, though he never shied away from decisive action when the right moment presented itself. Others lacked his patience. Henry IV of France, with his reliance on cavalry and his own impetuous character, often sought direct battle. Both men, though very different in temperament, found their share of success. Henry himself once remarked that his nobles rushed to battle as eagerly as they would to a banquet, certain that where there was fighting, victory would follow. The English, however, were not so convinced by French bravado, and sometimes mocked their allies' light skirmishes, comparing them unfavorably to the rough and dangerous sports at home. The indecisive wars of the 1590s, dominated by sieges and maneuvers rather than open battle, encouraged displays of personal honor that harked back to chivalric tradition. For some young nobles, war was not just about strategy, but about proving themselves through individual combat. The Earl of Essex went so far as to issue personal challenges during campaigns, to the Queen's dismay. Elizabeth detested such reckless gestures, seeing war not as a stage for glory, but as a ruinous drain on her treasury and a source of endless bloodshed. Yet for ambitious courtiers, combat offered a chance to earn distinction in a way impossible at court. Even when rumors circulated of grand contests, such as 400 English soldiers preparing to fight 400 Spaniards outside Paris, Elizabeth's anger was swift. To her, such duels were folly. To her knights, they were honor. Only when death struck close, as in the loss of Sir Philip Sidney or Essex's younger brother, did the harsh reality pierce the illusion of romance. Reports of such challenges were often exaggerated, not just for vanity, but also to reassure the Queen that her men were fighting bravely and her investment was worthwhile. captains and commanders knew that securing royal favor could depend on how their actions were reported. Men like Sir John Norris carefully listed their campaigns, ensuring their record of service was known at Whitehall. Behind the embellishments, however, the core truth remained. English soldiers were usually first in the assault, first into the trenches, and first to risk their lives, even if they were last to be rewarded with food or pay. Foreign commanders admired them. Sir Roger Williams once bluffed his way into capturing the fortress of Aumail by making his 600 men appear to be the vanguard of a much larger army. Fearing the English reputation for merciless assaults, the defenders surrendered within hours. Elsewhere, small groups of English pikemen and musketeers held off much larger forces of cavalry, confirming their value. Henry IV prized English infantry above all. His cavalry might deliver shock attacks, but only disciplined foot soldiers could sustain pressure or break through in sieges. English sappers, pioneers, and pikemen were indispensable, though cavalry units like Captain Anthony Shirley's also proved their worth in routing enemy forces. Again and again, the English proved first at frays. At Arnhem, Francis Vere's pikemen blocked Parma's cavalry, preventing a skirmish from becoming a disaster. At Guingamp, they stormed the suburbs at dawn, taking heavy risks in close combat. At Saint-Saëns in 1591, Williams's men smashed through barricades, fought their way into churches and cloisters, and forced mass surrenders after ferocious assaults. Their energy was relentless. Even after long marches, they hurled themselves at the enemy with grim determination. French allies admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that the English fought with the same fierce spirit as their fathers, and Catholic forces came to fear their very presence. On 22nd May 1591, the English under Sir John Norris pushed forward at Guingamp after a breach had been opened in the walls. Norris insisted that his men should have the honor of leading the assault. 200 soldiers under Captains Jackson, Hearn, and Wolfe scrambled up the steep incline with remarkable bravery. But the slope was too sharp, and their comrades failed to follow in strength. Hearn was killed, Wolfe received multiple wounds, and Jackson himself was badly injured. Though the English held their ground for half an hour under heavy fire, the attack faltered, and they were forced to retreat in good order. Losses were not catastrophic, but it was a sobering reminder that courage alone could not always carry a fortress. Throughout the autumn of 1591, however, English companies continued to spearhead attacks in campaign after campaign. Maurice of Nassau often placed them at the front of his assaults, counting on their reputation for ferocity to intimidate defenders into surrender. But not all commanders balanced daring with caution. Essex and his companions, Williams and Norris among them, sometimes displayed reckless bravado. During one reconnaissance at Guingamp, Captain Dennis advanced too far and was mortally wounded, while Essex himself earned a sharp rebuke from Elizabeth for throwing himself into danger as recklessly as the common soldiers. The Queen, ever mindful of the cost in lives, warned her favorite that he seemed more eager to run headlong into peril than to preserve the strength of his men. The wars in the Low Countries demanded both caution and adaptability. The terrain was varied. Boggy stretches that exhausted infantry, open plains suited to cavalry maneuvers, and the most sophisticated fortifications in Europe. It became a training ground for English officers and men. At Turnhout in 1597, Maurice and Sir Francis Vere executed a daring winter march to surprise the enemy. Though the Spanish column managed to slip away, Vere launched a furious pursuit, cutting into their rear and throwing the Catholic army into disarray. His timely cavalry charge forced the battle and ensured a Protestant victory. The Battle of Newport in 1600 demonstrated the same English boldness on an even larger scale. The States General had pushed Morris into a dangerous plan to seize coastal ports without first securing the hinterland. The initial clash went badly, but in the main battle, Sir Francis Vere once again proved decisive. Leading the vanguard of over 20 English companies, he placed his men on sandy hills overlooking the shoreline. When the Archduke's army advanced, they came under punishing fire from both Vere's musketeers on the dunes and Dutch warships offshore. As the tide narrowed the field and compressed the Spanish ranks, English pikemen met them in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Even when outnumbered, the combination of daring positioning and relentless assault turned the tide. Newport became one of the finest examples of late Elizabethan soldiering, with the English infantry at its heart. By the summer of 1600, the English contingent under Sir Francis Vere had already fought for hours at Newport, holding the line against wave after wave of Spanish assaults. Exhausted and without reinforcements, they were finally driven from the sandhills. But Vere rallied them around the artillery. Wounded himself, he ordered the gunners to unleash their cannon at the advancing enemy, while he gathered every available horseman and infantryman for a desperate counterattack. With renewed courage, his soldiers surged forward. Sharpshooters still clinging to the high ground poured fire into the Spanish ranks, and at last the Archduke's army broke. According to one witness, the English charge turned the tide, prompting Prince Maurice to cry out in admiration as the enemy fled. Nearly a third of Maurice's force at Newport was English. That reliance helps explain why the Dutch dreaded any hint of English withdrawal later in the 1590s. In fact, spending records show how Elizabeth's priorities shifted. In the late 1580s, more than £100,000 a year went to supporting the Dutch rebels, but by the mid-1590s, much of that money was being drained away to pay for the war in Ireland. Still, English garrisons remained in places like Flushing and Brill even after peace was signed with Spain in 1604, and English soldiers continued to serve in Protestant armies across Europe, sometimes privately, despite the treaty. By this period, English military service had become almost constant. Even under James I, companies of Englishmen could be found campaigning abroad, while in East Anglia, Dutch and Walloon militias helped defend English towns like Norwich. It was a reminder of how closely tied England and the Netherlands had become through war, trade, and religion. The men who filled these ranks were not faceless. They were professional soldiers whose careers stretched across decades and across continents. Captain Christopher Levens, for example, began as a private at Saint-Denis, served at Le Havre, joined the Berwick garrison, and then moved on to the Low Countries, Flushing, and even the Portugal expedition. His long career left him scarred by cannon and musket wounds, yet he fought both on land and sea until the Spanish advance finally ended his service. Others followed similar paths. Captain Roger Hussey, who moved between Ireland, France, and the Netherlands. Captain Henry Ward, who inherited his command after his own officer was killed. And men like Lieutenant William Mortimer and James Metcalfe, who spent 30 years moving between Berwick, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Normandy. These were hard men forged by endless campaigns, often wounded but still eager for service. They were the backbone of Elizabethan and early Jacobean warfare, professionals who lived and bled for causes that stretched from Ireland to France to the Low Countries, and who embodied the restless, martial spirit of their age. Sergeant Major James Johnson first saw action during the rebellion of 1569–70 and went on to fight across Ireland, the Low Countries, Normandy, and Brittany, even serving for a time with the Polish army. Lieutenant Richard Fletcher followed a similar path, beginning in the rebellion at home, and later fighting under Sir Roger Williams in the Netherlands before joining Sir Francis Vere as a gentleman soldier. Others, like Lieutenant Richard Newell, moved between the Low Countries, Portugal, and Brittany, while William West campaigned in Flanders and Brabant, then marched with Essex in Normandy, eventually rising to Provost Marshal under Williams. Wounds were common in such careers. West broke his shoulder at Bergen-op-Zoom and re-injured it later in France. The same pattern appeared in the lives of men like Lieutenant John Price, who shifted between the Low Countries, France, and Ireland, or Rowland Hempson, who served in Ireland, Bergen, Ostend, and beyond. Robert Deckham began as a sergeant in Ireland, sailed with Captain Cecil on an Indians voyage, fought at Santo Domingo and Cartagena with Drake, and later volunteered under Norris in Brittany. James Jones followed a similar route, moving from service in Ireland and the Netherlands to overseas voyages. Many lieutenants who marched with Essex in Normandy carried the same breadth of experience. William Wood, for example, had spent years in Ireland as a cavalryman and sergeant before rising to lieutenant in the Low Countries, serving with Leicester, Willoughby, and Vere, despite suffering repeated gunshot wounds. Williams himself seemed to attract such veterans, recruiting men like Richard Ure, whose resume included campaigns in the Low Countries, Portugal, France, and Normandy. Even ensigns like George Orrell moved fluidly between theaters, sailing for Nuremberg, serving under Philip Sidney, then shifting to the Portugal expedition, and later a voyage with the Earl of Cumberland. These stories show clearly how Elizabethan soldiers became an adaptable, mobile corps of professionals, comfortable on land and at sea, and always chasing the next campaign. When these men returned home, however, their service was often forgotten. Veterans lived out their last years in their shires, supported not by the Crown but by local funds for the maimed. Robert Rolls, an 85-year-old disabled veteran of the Low Countries Wars, and Sergeant George Smythe, who had fought from Ireland to Denmark to Cadiz, were among those living in Wiltshire on community support. Another trooper, Thomas Hamlin, wounded at Jülich, also spent his final years there. These men were reminders of how every English county had paid in blood for wars fought abroad. To the Crown, their service had been useful, but once back in England, they were quietly dispersed, pressed men and volunteers alike, sent away from London and back to their villages, where their presence was less visible. Even so, English soldiers never stopped shaping the wider conflicts of Europe. Volunteers and mercenaries under Sir Horace Vere and others played vital roles in continental wars leading up to the 30 Years' War. When James I considered sending a massive force of 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry to defend the Palatinate in 1621, it was to Vere and his circle that he turned for guidance. By 1622, Vere was commanding as a general in the service of the King of Great Britain, and it was under his authority that peace was made at Mannheim. From the first expeditions of the 1570s through to these later campaigns, English arms had become indispensable to the Protestant cause. Britain itself had remained secure from invasion, but her soldiers had gained vast experience in the art of war, in logistics, in siegecraft, and in the use of artillery, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond the shores of their own island. By the late 16th century, warfare had entered what many call the Age of Bastions. The tall, thin medieval walls that once ringed cities were giving way to squat, angular fortifications designed to withstand and even exploit the growing power of artillery. Yet, as Sir John Smythe observed in the 1590s, this so-called revolution did not erase the fundamental realities of siegecraft. Comparing Edward III's long investment of Calais in the 14th century with the Duke of Parma's elaborate encirclement of Antwerp 2 centuries later, Smythe argued that despite the thunder of cannon, commanders old and new were bound by the same truth. The surest way to take a fortress was not reckless assault, but slow pressure, often starving the defenders into submission. Artillery certainly had its impact. Cannons and culverins could shatter old walls, and the new Tres Italienne fortresses were specifically built to absorb such punishment while allowing defenders to rake attackers with deadly flanking fire. Yet, Smythe insisted, the balance between offense and defense had remained remarkably constant. Technology had advanced, but the general's challenge was unchanged: to capture strongholds without wasting his army's blood. In this, Smythe echoed Machiavelli, who had also stressed the defensive strength of modern fortifications. Even in the wars of Elizabeth's reign, English commanders found themselves locked in laborious sieges, where defense was often the key to victory. English soldiers became particularly adept at this kind of warfare. Their strengths lay in powerful ordnance, skilled miners and sappers from the West Country, disciplined assault infantry, and well-regarded gunpowder supplies. Engineers such as John Rogers, Richard Lee, Henry Lee, and later Paul Ive helped refine fortification techniques, building structures like Pendennis Castle and publishing manuals that spread English expertise abroad. Other nations often recruited English pioneers for mining, artillery, or shock infantry, and English powder itself was highly prized. The Low Countries proved to be a school of war for these men. At battles and sieges such as Sluys, Bergen op Zoom, Rheinberg, Breda, and Coevorden, English troops demonstrated their adaptability. At Geertruidenberg in 1593, for example, they carried out a thorough circumvallation, defeated a relief column alongside their Frisian allies, and forced the town to surrender. Sir Francis Vere then led his men north through Brabant, fending off Spanish counterattacks before preparing for the next major campaign at Groningen. Through such campaigns, English forces showed that siegecraft was not merely about walls and guns, but about patience, engineering skill, and the disciplined application of firepower. For all the talk of a military revolution, the essence of the art of war, as Smythe had said, remained much the same: to take strongholds effectively, while sparing the lives of one's soldiers as much as possible. Through the spring of 1594, English forces continued to demonstrate their skill in the harsh environment of the Low Countries. The Groningen campaign revealed exactly why warfare in this region was so exhausting. Rapid deployments, constant mobility, and the need for infantry to keep up with the cavalry were expected of soldiers who had already endured long months of garrison duty. In this theater, night attacks, secret plots inside cities, and protracted sieges were common occurrences. Vere's men were repeatedly called into action, often alongside Protestant allies, and sometimes together with the English garrison at Ostend. Their efforts were designed to strengthen Prince Maurice's army for siege warfare, particularly in the case of Groningen. During the assault, the Scots made a fierce impression, storming a ravelin after it was blown apart by mines. Survivors of the blast were cut down in brutal hand-to-hand fighting or drowned as the defenses collapsed. The defenders did not strike back lightly. In the English trenches, carnage was equally severe. Captain Rey's company was surrounded during a sortie and wiped out, Rey himself perishing with his men. Sir Edward Brooke suffered a horrific wound that tore through his chest and lungs. Captains Bell and Swan were both struck by enemy fire, while 2 more captains in Vere's own regiment were killed. Casualties among officers, lieutenants, and ensigns were so high that the campaign earned a reputation for sheer brutality, one echoed by Sir John Smythe's grim remarks on the war. It was a reminder, as Sir Philip Sidney had also learned, that artillery and gunfire cut down the finest men in the bloodiest fashion. Even Vere himself would be badly wounded later at Ostend. Despite the assumption that siege warfare removed the drama of open battle, the reality was far from static. The long siege of Ostend, 1601 to 1604, proved this. Life in the trenches was frantic, with days and nights consumed by fortifications, assaults, countermines, and sudden sallies. Both sides were close to victory at different points, and each day seemed to offer the possibility of a decisive breakthrough. Though the front lines hardly shifted, the contest was never truly stalemated. The struggle became the central focus of the 80 Years' War, with Catholic Europe pouring immense wealth and manpower into Archduke Albert's attempt to capture the town. But as long as supplies could reach Ostend by sea, the garrison remained stubbornly secure. By the summer of 1601, Francis Vere had taken charge of the town's defense. He landed with a veteran English contingent, reinforcing the existing Dutch companies, and quickly reshaped the fortifications. More English recruits followed in waves, often marked by their distinctive red uniforms, bringing numbers and morale. Trenches and underground cabins transformed Ostend into a fortress that foreshadowed the battlefields of the First World War. Supplies arrived in steady streams from England: food, weapons, and even beer. Meanwhile, the Archduke unleashed an endless storm of artillery fire, with thousands of rounds thundering against the walls. Yet the defenses held, and the besieged not only repaired their guns, but often fielded superior artillery to their attackers. The siege dragged on for years, draining lives and resources from both sides. By 1603, losses were staggering. The Catholics had already lost around 18,000 men, while the defenders counted at least 6,000 to 7,000 dead. Still, neither side yielded. Ostend remained a symbol of Protestant resilience and Catholic determination. In this grinding struggle of trenches, cannon fire, and shifting tides, Francis Vere's leadership ensured that the town endured longer than anyone could have expected, making Ostend one of the most infamous sieges of its age. In the dark days leading up to Christmas 1601, Ostend was on the brink of collapse. Strong contrary winds had blocked reinforcements and supplies from entering the harbor, and the English garrison had dwindled to barely 800 men. Their Dutch and Allied comrades were also under strength, while Archduke Albert's forces crept ever closer, seizing outer defenses and preparing for a full-scale assault. Facing the real possibility that the town could fall within hours, Francis Vere turned to deception. He proposed negotiations with the Archduke, hoping to buy time. 2 English officers, Captains Ogle and Fairfax, were handed over as hostages, and the talks dragged on for 2 days. Then fortune intervened. A change in the winds brought 3 Dutch warships into harbor on Christmas Day, carrying soldiers and much-needed supplies, including food for the holiday. Vere reclaimed his hostages, ended the negotiations, and once again committed to holding the fortress. His quick thinking and bold ruse had saved Ostend. Enraged, the Archduke launched a massive assault on the 7th of January, 1602. Every strongpoint was attacked at once: Sand Hill, the Porcupine, the East and West Ravelins, and the South Square. Vere, anticipating the onslaught, had carefully rebuilt his defenses and deliberately left certain positions exposed to lure in the attackers. As thousands of Spanish soldiers swarmed the works under cover of darkness, Vere gave the signal. Fires lit up the night, revealing the attackers, and English and Dutch guns unleashed a storm of shot and shrapnel. Eyewitnesses described cannons firing chains, nails and bags filled with musket balls into the crowded ranks, cutting men down in horrifying numbers. The tide was rising, and when Vere ordered the sluices opened, floodwaters swept through the low ground, breaking the enemy's resolve. The assault turned into a slaughter. Dead and wounded lay heaped around the fortifications, with bodies carried away by the tide as far as Calais. Those Spaniards who had gained a foothold in one of the outer defenses were quickly surrounded and cut down. By dawn, an estimated 1,500 enemy soldiers lay dead, with perhaps another 500 drowned or dragged away by their comrades. A quarter of the Archduke's army had been destroyed in a single night. As one witness put it, Vere's murderous guns brought the enemy down like ripe apples shaken from the trees in a storm. The long siege of Ostend showed that the English were no longer seen as mere auxiliaries, but as trusted partners in the evolving science of siege warfare. Their reputation had grown during the wars of religion, thanks not only to their performance in the field, but also to the quality of their powder, weapons, and engineering skills. English artillery, especially the cast-iron cannon produced in Sussex, became prized throughout Europe. Unlike the less reliable guns from Sweden and Denmark, English pieces were affordable, dependable, and widely exported. This success stemmed from Henry VIII's policy of linking traditional trades like shipbuilding and carriage-making to the demands of war, which by Elizabeth's time had turned England into a major supplier of iron cannon. The Crown itself granted licenses for export under royal warrant, and by the 1590s, Dutch allies were requesting hundreds of English guns for their ships and coastal defenses. Official sales were supplemented by a thriving black market. Smugglers concealed cannon under shipments of timber or other goods, moving them from Sussex and Kent into the ports of the Low Countries. Figures such as Thomas Burbride of Sandwich and Edward Nichols of New Haven acted almost like arms dealers, supplying towns like Middleburg, Vere, and Flushing. Even when authorities tried to restrict sales, Dutch magistrates argued that the guns were bound to find their way abroad, so better to let Protestant allies purchase them directly than to drive the trade underground. At the same time, English expertise in gunnery was being codified in a growing body of printed works. From the Digges family to Robert Norton, authors published detailed studies of artillery, its types, and its uses. Norton's The Gunner became a key text, part of a wider literature that combined mathematics, geometry, and historical examples with practical advice on testing, mounting, and firing ordnance. Earlier, Roger Ascham's Toxophilus and William Bourne's Manuals had also addressed the subject. These works were less concerned with the logistics of moving and storing cannon than with theory, design, and classification. But they nevertheless reflected England's growing stature in the art of war. Nowhere was this more visible than at the Tower of London. Though often remembered as a prison, the Tower was the symbolic heart of England's military organization. It served as the chief arsenal of the realm, a place where cannon, muskets, powder, and pikes were stored alongside the records and accounts of the Office of Ordnance. By 1620, inventories listed hundreds of bronze and iron guns housed in the White Tower, thousands of muskets and pikes, and even older weapons like bows and arquebuses. Surrounding districts, such as the Minories, bustled with craftsmen, gunmakers, wheelwrights, armorers, whose work supported the supply of weapons. The tower itself was not modernized in the continental style, with angled bastions or elaborate earthworks. Venetian envoys mocked its medieval walls, and Elizabeth I avoided it altogether, likely due to its grim associations. Yet despite its cold, damp, and forbidding atmosphere, the tower remained the central hub of England's military machine. Here, the master of the ordnance kept residence, clerks maintained records, and weapons were catalogued and repaired. Over the centuries, even as monarchs changed and new fortresses arose elsewhere, the tower endured as both a symbol and a storehouse of English power. It represented the country's ability to wage war, supplying the iron thunder that echoed across Europe from the age of the Tudors into that of the Stuarts. The Tower of London stood as the secure vault of England's wealth and warlike power. Inside its walls were kept the crown's treasure, its jewels, its weapons, and its store of coin. Powder and shot were held so close to the regalia that in 1623 voices were raised suggesting the arsenal should be moved elsewhere for safety. Though no longer a royal residence, the tower remained the heart of military organization. Even Henry VIII, famous for resisting continental styles of fortification, had strengthened its northern corners with new bulwarks early in his reign. The White Tower itself served as a gun platform during the Tudor era, while outlying defenses revealed just how cautious and conservative English military architecture could be. The rise of the Office of Ordnance made the tower more than a fortress. It became a bustling center of administration. By the 1510s, the master of the ordnance had been given improved lodgings within the brick tower, ensuring he could oversee paperwork and supplies without delay. The tempo of military activity under Henry VIII was reflected here, as repairs and new works signaled England's ambition to re-emerge as a European power. At the same time, the growing link between sea power and artillery demanded stronger bureaucratic machinery. The Ordnance Office mirrored the structure of the Navy Board, with its master, lieutenant, treasurer, surveyor, and clerk. A special liaison, the master of naval ordnance, ensured naval demands for guns and powder were met, tying England's fleets ever more closely to the tower's resources. Yet the system was riddled with contradictions. Officials blurred the line between crown business and private profit, leasing property around the tower to craftsmen, gunmakers, and wheelwrights. These workshops crowded against the ancient walls, creating a dangerous warren of flammable sheds. Corruption and nepotism flourished. Offices such as the keeper of the small arms became family sinecures, while repairs and maintenance were often subcontracted to private gunmakers for extra fees. Accusations of bribery, embezzlement, and inflated prices were constant. Yet despite its flaws, the system delivered. Guns were produced, powder supplied, and armies equipped. England's military organization remained deeply decentralized. This had advantages. It kept costs down and allowed the crown to spread burdens across regions. Food and clothing for soldiers were best secured through a patchwork of local contracts, while cannon and munitions were centralized in the tower. Campaigns in France and Scotland during the 1540s tested this structure, and for a time it performed remarkably well, supplying vast armies and even amphibious operations. But centralization proved impossible. Food gathered from across England often spoiled before reaching soldiers, and complaints from commanders, especially in Ireland, were frequent. Despite these difficulties, England managed to sustain campaigns on multiple fronts at the turn of the 17th century. Ports like Chester, Bristol, Plymouth, and Southampton became lifelines, funneling men and supplies across the Irish Sea. From these outports, long military roads wound through the countryside, with wagon trains of cannon and columns of weary recruits trudging toward embarkation points. Mayors and local officials took on unusual responsibilities, billeting troops, arranging supplies, and even acting as enforcers to catch deserters. For civic leaders, it was an unwelcome and sometimes dangerous duty. The mayor of Bristol famously found himself stoned by unruly soldiers. Yet, through this imperfect system, England kept its wars alive, balancing local resources with the central authority of the Tower, the symbolic and practical core of the nation's military power. Sailors and shipowners proved just as difficult to manage as soldiers, since most could earn far more from ordinary trade than from transporting troops to Ireland. To deal with this, the Privy Council appointed supervisors who oversaw shipping, seizing vessels when necessary and forcing crews into service. Barnstaple, whose struggling maritime economy welcomed the work, became known for gathering transports. But most other ports resented the disruption. Continental wars had damaged overseas trade at a time when English merchants were beginning to tap into the profitable carrying trade, and local shipping interests often suffered more than they gained from government contracts. Shipmasters might earn only a few shillings per ton each month, or a set fee per soldier carried, which was often judged excessive. In the end, private profit from the Irish wars rarely trickled down to those actually manning the ships. Tensions also arose between local officials and private contractors. Both competed for grain and supplies, scouring the countryside and sometimes clashing over authority. In Bristol, for example, Mayor Roger Johns in 1560 purchased wheat and malt from surrounding counties to send directly with troops to the Earl of Sussex in Ireland, using royal funds advanced through temporary receivers. Similar arrangements were made elsewhere, with mayors reimbursed later by the Crown. By the late 1590s, these ad hoc systems of finance and supply were still in use, with Crown officials reimbursing local leaders for the costs of outfitting and shipping soldiers. The effectiveness of campaigns often came down to how quickly food, clothing, and weapons reached the men in the field. Complaints were frequent: rotten rations, uniforms that didn't fit, shortages of shoes, and dishonest victuallers. Of the different supply systems, the Ordnance Office, which managed weapons and munitions centrally, proved the most reliable. Its work became more efficient during the 9 Years' War, not through careful planning from London, but out of necessity. In 1600, Lord Justice Loftus bluntly told Robert Cecil that if such resources had been sent earlier, countless soldiers' lives might have been spared. Food itself became both a weapon and a prize. Reports from English commanders listed not only enemy dead, but also herds of cattle seized and fields burned. Yet unlike on the continent, where invading armies often lived off plunder, Ireland's situation was different. Both sides needed the cooperation of civilians, particularly in towns. In some areas, clan rivalries or local politics determined whether troops found support or hostility. Even in the Pale, where loyalty to England was strongest, civilians were often reluctant to contribute financially, provoking bitter resentment from the very soldiers protecting them. Despite these challenges, the Privy Council paid close attention to soldiers' diets. Rations typically consisted of bread or biscuit, butter, and cheese, with occasional pork or fish. But fish proved unpopular with soldiers and difficult to preserve. The result was a monotonous and uneven diet that shifted according to availability and cost. In this way, the hardships of war were felt daily at the table, as the men endured long campaigns on food that rarely matched the crown's promises. We know what English soldiers ate in Ireland because the crown required detailed certificates listing the food loaded onto ships. Contractors swore that the provisions were sweet, wholesome, and good. Yet complaints from the field were constant. Food that left English ports in decent condition often reached Ireland spoiled or was tampered with along the way. In Dublin, penalties could be harsh. In 1581, the Bakers' Guild was fined heavily for supplying bad biscuit to the army, and several officials responsible for inspection were thrown into prison. Feeding and clothing the army was the single greatest expense of the war. More than any single bureaucratic design, it was the determination of government officials to enforce standards that shaped the outcome in Ireland. Centralization mattered less than consistency. George Beverley, Comptroller of Victuals in Ireland, had to send regular certificates to the Privy Council in London every 2 months, reporting on supplies. The Queen herself demanded similar reports from muster officers. But the system was fragile. Ireland's difficult terrain, the small size of the logistical bureaucracy, and shortages of manpower made reliable figures almost impossible. When commissaries claimed ignorance about their stores, it was often because of genuine confusion, not simply corruption. Still, corruption and conflict were frequent. With so many private contractors, government supervisors, and local officials involved, interests clashed. In 1602, Beverley investigated the Dublin bakehouses and accused Joseph Crewe, the master baker, of producing coarse bread while selling the best grain privately in the city markets. Soldiers grumbled that they were left with spoiled food while merchants profited from black market sales. Beverley's accusations touched powerful men, including contractors John Joles and William Cockayne, and Commissary Robert Newcomen. Before long, Beverley himself faced counter-accusations before the Privy Council. The entire supply chain, from bakers to commissaries, was riddled with rivalry, patronage, and suspicion. That same year, the Privy Council tasked Newcomen with feeding the entire English army in Ireland. He and his partners Jolls and Cockayne agreed to supply soldiers in Leinster, Connaught, and Ulster for 5 pence a day per man. Half the money came from the London Exchequer, the rest from Dublin. Commissaries in Ireland were expected to check the quality of food and administer oaths to bakers. Most supplies, grain, biscuit, and butter, came from England, but beef and corn were purchased locally. The Queen even reimbursed contractors for the cost of the bags used to carry biscuit. These arrangements showed how closely private enterprise and royal authority had become linked in the business of war. Each campaign required new systems, tailored to circumstances. Overseas expeditions, such as those of 1513, 1544, or 1596, relied on close cooperation with the Navy. When Buckingham led the ill-fated expedition to the Isle of Rey in 1627, victualling was placed in the hands of Sir Sackville Crowe, a man with experience in finance, arms production, and logistics. Working with William Russell and financier Philip Berlamachi, he organized supplies for 12,000 men, coordinated refits, and arranged payments to localities providing food and services. But even with skilled administrators, shortages of capital meant that food was often bought cheaply and stored badly. At Plymouth, in the winter of 1625, soldiers awaiting transport starved in the streets, while bodies were thrown overboard from ships anchored in the harbor. Officers were not spared. Captain Bowles himself died as hunger swept through the ranks. In the end, the ability to feed and clothe armies determined whether England's campaigns could even begin, let alone succeed. Supplying armies in the early 17th century meant more than raising men. It meant clothing, feeding, and transporting them on a scale England had never attempted before. The Crown's large orders for summer and winter apparel gave entrepreneurs steady business, edging production toward something resembling mass manufacture. Yet the contractors who provided food and supplies for Charles I's campaigns often lost more than they gained. Many were left with unpaid debts, while others, like the financier Philip Burlamachi, saw their fortunes collapse under the strain. A few suppliers took the risk, like Robert Swan, a linen draper who employed hundreds of cloth workers to make shirts for thousands of soldiers and sailors, but mismatches between orders and actual troop numbers left him with piles of unused stock. In truth, investors preferred the booming global trade of the period to the uncertain profits of military supply. By the 1620s and 1630s, mistrust between Crown and contractors had grown so deep that some refused to victual the Royal Navy unless they were paid in cash. Large expeditions strained the system further. Armies of 12,000 men needed food, clothing, and transport on a scale beyond the reach of regular suppliers, forcing the government to draw in smaller, less reliable wholesalers. Even the sailors fared better than the infantry, whose rations were monotonous and often resented. Fish, in particular, was despised, and efforts to diversify diets with pork, peas, or gruel made from rice and oatmeal hardly satisfied the men. The scale of consumption was staggering. By 1639, a 20,000-man army needed over 600,000 pounds of bread for a 6-month campaign. Soldiers received daily rations of 2 pounds of bread and 2 quarts of beer. To meet such demand, portable copper ovens were introduced, each capable of baking thousands of loaves a day, though even in England, shortages still led to mutiny. At Goswick, near Berwick, hunger drove men to the brink of rebellion when bread failed to arrive. Wagon loads of supplies, delayed by profiteering transport officers and exhausted livestock, eventually reached the camp, but not before discipline nearly collapsed. Behind the front lines, logistics grew ever more complicated. The East Smithfield Depot in London, with its mills, bakehouses, and slaughterhouses, served the Navy as the Tower did the Army. But by the 1630s, even this hub was overcrowded and unsafe, until reforms cleared away the dangerous clutter of workshops that had sprung up around it. Moving food north to Newcastle or Berwick remained a formidable challenge. Counties were ordered to provide horses, carts, and drivers at short notice. Hundreds of wagons carried ammunition, tents, and bread, while communities bore the cost in dead animals and rising resentment. The bishops' wars exposed every weakness. Bad weather, poor supplies, and unpaid wages left soldiers destitute. Men camped without tents, went barefoot, and drank spoiled beer. At times they mutinied, even slaughtering their officers' cattle to survive. After defeats like Newburn in 1640, the commissariat was in such disarray that the Lord Mayor of York himself had to hire carts and send out loaves of bread and cheese to feed the starving regiments. The burdens fell hardest on the northern shires, especially Yorkshire, where troops billeted themselves on civilians and often helped themselves to food by force. What emerges is a picture of an overstretched military system, improvising at every turn. Armies could be raised, fleets could be launched, but without reliable bread, beer, and wagons, campaigns faltered. Logistics, mundane, costly, and often chaotic, was as decisive as any battle fought in the field. In the bishops' wars, discipline and supply often broke down with disastrous consequences. At South Shields, near Newcastle, soldiers from Sir Jacob Ashley's regiment were welcomed kindly by a local bailiff. But instead of showing gratitude, some repaid his hospitality by stealing cattle and causing havoc. Their colonel punished them severely, yet one soldier, driven by spite, set fire to a valuable haystack. He was quickly caught, and on the 20th of May, while the entire army marched past, he was executed on a newly built gallows. A sign marked his crime, for willful and malicious burning of a stack of hay. This harsh example, the first of its kind, showed how strict martial law was meant to instill fear and control over unruly troops. Discipline was not always enough to stop looting. Colonel Fielding admitted his men stole sheep simply because they had no money to buy food, and when animals weren't available, soldiers hunted deer. Civilians across the north were forced to provide bread, cheese, fodder, and livestock, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Local officials often had to reimburse townspeople from their own pockets. The bitterness of billeting and requisitioning was a burden northern communities would carry well into the 1640s. In York, commanders tried to limit disorder by separating horse and foot. Cavalry were kept outside the city, infantry scattered in villages, while only the king's household lodged within the walls. Still, rivalry between the horse and foot often flared into quarrels, especially when drink was involved. Tensions between the Earl of Essex, who commanded the infantry, and the Earl of Holland, who led the cavalry, only made matters worse. Even senior officers clashed. At York in 1639, a violent dispute broke out between Captain Honeywood, a quartermaster for the infantry, and Commissary General Wilmot, responsible for the cavalry. Swords were drawn over questions of authority in supply, and Wilmot was briefly jailed by Colonel Goring. These quarrels revealed how fragile the commissariat system was, and how easily arguments over duties and privileges could explode into open conflict. The Crown's reliance on local militias further complicated matters. Parish armories and county stores were often poorly equipped. The Privy Council scrambled to press timber for pikes and to mark communal weapons with the king's initials. Weapons had to be shipped by sea from London to Hull, and then dragged overland to the regiments. But shortages of carts and transport in 1640 crippled the artillery train. Powder and lead stockpiled in Newcastle proved useless when officials forgot to supply bullet molds. It is sometimes claimed that English warfare lagged behind continental Europe, that England relied on allies for artillery and misunderstood logistics. But Ireland challenges that assumption. From the 16th century onwards, Ireland became a laboratory for innovation. The Tudors embraced gunpowder weapons without abandoning the longbow, and heavy artillery was dragged across Irish terrain as early as the 1530s. By the 1590s, towns like Limerick had modern bastioned defenses, and by 1611, new angled bulwarks were added to castles, providing flanking fire in line with European military design. Accounts of the defense of Limerick in 1642, with mines, countermines, artillery duels, and civilian suffering, echo the brutal sieges of Ostend. Though outsiders might have dismissed Ireland as a military backwater, from the English perspective it was central. Each decade saw new developments in the art of war, English and Gaelic alike, until the island was consumed in the devastating conflicts of 1641 to 1650. The horrors of Antwerp in 1576 were fresh in English minds, and Elizabeth's soldiers knew well the tales of massacred Protestant garrisons. the ferocity and religious bitterness of the Irish wars echoed the brutality of the Low Countries and foreshadowed the devastation that would later define the 30 Years' War. English troops themselves absorbed the ruthless methods of Irish warfare, where treachery and bloodshed were commonplace. One chilling account records how an officer's financial allowances were offset by the reward he received for delivering the severed head of Shane O'Neill. In 1595 alone, 36 heads of Feadh MacHugh's followers were paraded through Dublin. The crushing of the Desmond Rebellion briefly stabilized costs, with the Irish military establishment consuming about £45,000 annually in the mid-1580s, and closer to £25,000 to £30,000 per year by the early 1590s. Yet even in quieter years, money was scarce. In May 1590, frustration boiled over at Limerick when a veteran garrison went months without pay. Denied credit by local townsfolk, 77 hungry soldiers had to choose between starvation and defiance. They chose mutiny. With fife and drum, they marched on Dublin Castle demanding their wages. Their protest was tense but restrained. Though weapons were raised and tempers flared, they stopped short of outright violence. Eventually, the men submitted, and most were thrown into prison. Two truths emerged from this episode. The soldiers, despite their suffering, still respected royal authority, and the government itself could barely sustain even its garrisons, let alone fight extended campaigns. By the early 1590s, attention shifted back to Ulster, where conflict flared once more. Garrisons became the heart of strategy, as England struggled to secure them, much as it had done in Scotland and the Netherlands. But Hugh O'Neill's uprising changed everything. His early victories revealed that Irish forces had mastered modern weapons and tactics, using ambushes and surprise attacks to devastating effect. Logistical failures that once only delayed operations now threatened the survival of entire armies. Relief columns were vulnerable targets, and disasters like the rout at the Ford of the Biscuits, where soldiers abandoned supplies in panic, became grim symbols of the struggle. In February 1595, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, made his rebellion unmistakably clear by destroying Blackwater Fort, the stronghold that guarded Ulster. 3 months later, Sir Henry Bagenal set out from Newry with nearly 1,700 infantry and 250 cavalry to resupply the garrison at Monaghan. Many of his men were veterans from Brittany, but others were raw recruits straight from England. Bagenal expected little resistance. O'Neill thought otherwise. His forces shadowed the march, striking at narrow roads and harassing the English camp. An English officer admitted, with reluctant respect, that the Irish soldiers showed unmatched skill with firearms. Many of them, in fact, had once been trained by the Crown itself, back when O'Neill had posed as a loyal subject. After relieving the Monaghan garrison, Bagenal began his return march. But his column had already burned through much of its powder. Only 10 barrels had been issued in total. Lord Deputy Russell had scoffed at complaints, remarking that this was Ireland, not Holland. The shortage would prove disastrous. On 26th and 27th May, O'Neill unleashed between 2,000 and 4,000 troops in a running battle that stretched for nearly 8 hours. Casualties mounted on both sides, and although Bagenal's soldiers managed to escape, they had been battered and demoralized. Only the stubborn defense of his veterans and pressed recruits prevented a total rout. At one point, an Englishman named Seagrave nearly struck down O'Neill himself in single combat, but lost his life in the attempt. The fight at Clontibret revealed just how much the English depended on steady leadership. and how dangerous their lack of officers and supplies truly was. In the years that followed, the Crown sent in seasoned men from other fronts to steady its Irish forces. Veterans of Portugal, Brittany, Picardy, and the Netherlands were transferred to stiffen the ranks of inexperienced levies. Sir John Norris brought 1,300 veterans from the Low Countries in 1597, and eventually thousands more were sent after the disaster at the Yellow Ford in 1598. Yet even the presence of these hardened soldiers could not mask deeper problems. Quarrels among commanders, scarce resources, and endless disputes at court hampered any sustained effort to crush O'Neill. That same year, Sir John Chichester, newly appointed governor of Carrickfergus, scored bold victories with surprise amphibious assaults and clever sallies against Irish forces. But in November 1597, his luck ran out. Facing James MacDonell and his Scots-Irish allies, Chichester's tired men advanced against what appeared to be a smaller enemy force on a nearby hill. What they did not know was that hundreds of hidden reinforcements lay in ambush. When the English line faltered, MacDonell's cavalry and shot surged forward, overwhelming the center. Chichester and many of his officers fell in the chaos. Later reports revealed the deception. While only 700 Irish had been visible at first, nearly 1,500, including 500 skilled gunners, had been waiting in reserve. Caught with spent powder and broken ranks, the English suffered a crushing defeat. On the 14th of August, 1598, Sir Henry Bagenal set out to relieve Blackwater Fort, unaware that his force would soon face one of the most decisive ambushes in Irish history. With nearly 4,000 infantry, 300 cavalry, artillery in tow, including a heavy sacre, and a mix of seasoned veterans and raw recruits, his column marched across the uneven rolling ground that separated camp from fort. Bagenal intended to move in traditional formation, ready to close ranks at the first sign of attack. But the terrain broke his regiments apart, and O'Neill's men, masters of the new style of Irish warfare, seized their chance. As the English moved forward, the Irish launched repeated strikes. Firefights flared across the hills, slowing and fragmenting the column. Coordination faltered. Pikemen and musketeers struggled to protect one another, and disaster struck when an English match accidentally ignited barrels of powder. Amidst the chaos, Bagenal himself was killed by a shot to the face, and morale collapsed. The English line crumbled into retreat. Still, it was not a total massacre. Commanders like Sir Richard Wingfield managed to pull survivors back, saving hundreds of men from annihilation. Even so, the Battle of the Yellow Ford marked the greatest Gaelic victory over English arms. O'Neill's decision not to butcher the fleeing soldiers may have been deliberate. Total destruction might have forced Elizabeth to unleash far greater numbers in retaliation. Instead, the strategy of attrition, wearing down rather than provoking overwhelming force, remained the hallmark of Irish resistance. England, already burdened with commitments in France, the Low Countries, and at sea against Spain, could never bring its full strength to bear on Ireland. Still, the Crown had to respond. Proposals were made to raise 11,000 new men for Ulster. Yet the cost was staggering. With royal coffers drained by continental wars, Elizabeth turned to the shires, filling her Irish armies with poorly trained recruits. This influx, while necessary, compounded the very weaknesses that had doomed Bagenal's column. By 1599, the government was forced to transform its supply systems and integrate a more professional standing force with traditional local levies. Sir George Carey, newly appointed as treasurer, soon realized the scale of the crisis. Nearly £500,000 would be needed to sustain the campaign. a staggering sum for the crown. Essex was then dispatched with one of the largest English armies ever seen in Ireland. 16,000 infantry, 1,300 horse, and the full machinery of war. But even Essex, proud and ambitious, was daunted. The English foot soldiers, he complained, lacked both training and spirit, while O'Neill's men were strong, skilled, and quick to exploit any weakness. These fears seemed justified when, in May 1599, Sir Henry Harrington's smaller garrison force was pursued through Wicklow. The English cavalry fought hard to cover the retreat, but when the musketeers unleashed a rolling volley, many panicked, dropped their weapons, and fled. With too few junior officers to rally them, the rear collapsed. As so often in the 1590s, a retreating English column was easy prey for O'Neill's relentless fighters. On the 5th of August 1599, disaster struck again. At the Curlew Hills, an English column of nearly 1,500 infantry and 200 horse was caught in the same trap that had doomed so many before. After wasting much of their powder in defensive skirmishes, the ranks broke. Gaelic forces poured in, killing 10 officers and over 200 men, with many more wounded. It was yet another reminder that English tactics had still not adapted to the transformed face of Irish warfare. Essex, marching under the banner of St. George, managed some small victories in Munster, skirmishes, sieges like that at Cahir Castle. But these were minor achievements. They did nothing to conceal the wider failure. The English had not yet found a way to overcome O'Neill's revitalized Celtic strategy. By the year's end, the English army was tired, scattered across garrisons, and stripped of momentum. A force that had been raised for conquest now huddled on the defensive. Elizabeth was furious. She had seen her commanders squander chances before, in the Low Countries, in Portugal, and now Ireland looked the same. She wanted decisive victories, not excuses. But the system of dispersing men into small garrisons left them too weak to act boldly, while sending them out in columns simply played into the enemy's hands. Training was another problem. Veterans from the Netherlands could have stiffened English ranks, but too often they were matched with raw recruits who broke at the first shock. Essex's eventual withdrawal was not just a failure of nerve. It was the result of frustration with an enemy who refused to fight the kind of battle he wanted. While the English struggled, the rebels pressed their advantage. They forced columns to march endlessly across hostile ground, draining their strength, while weather, hunger, and sickness did the rest. At the same time, O'Neill's envoys sought aid abroad, appealing to Rome and Madrid. Not every Catholic leader wanted Spain to intervene, but Philip II, and after him his son, saw England's defeat as a matter of honor and faith. In 1601, that aid finally came. Spanish troops landed at Kinsale in County Cork, changing everything. What had been an Anglo-Irish war of attrition was now part of Europe's larger conflict. Spain's arrival gave O'Neill his greatest chance. For years, the Irish had excelled in ambushes, raids, and guerrilla fighting. Now, with continental allies at their side, they had the opportunity to face England in a set-piece battle and perhaps drive them from Ireland entirely. For Mountjoy, the English commander, the invasion was both a threat and an opportunity. At last, he would have the decisive confrontation the crown had long sought. But the stakes were immense. If the Irish and Spanish joined effectively, England's position could collapse. The Spaniards, under Don Juan del Aguila, chose Kinsale as their landing point. It was not the best ground. They might have been wiser to head for Cork, but they dug in, waiting for allies to arrive. O'Neill's army was now better trained and larger than ever before. and Gaelic risings threatened the English across the island. Yet when the moment came, coordination faltered. The Spanish, lacking cavalry, could not scout effectively, while the Irish hesitated to commit to open battle. Mountjoy, meanwhile, advanced from Cork with around 4,300 effectives, far fewer than the numbers on paper, but backed by the promise of reinforcements at sea. As October turned to winter, the stage was set. The Spanish held Kinsale, the Irish gathered in strength, and the English entrenched themselves in a siege that would decide the future of Ireland. For the rebels, it was the best opportunity they would ever have. For Mountjoy, it was the chance to prove that England could endure, even against a resolute Gaelic army supported by Spain's might. The fate of Ireland hung in the balance. By the late autumn of 1601, the balance of military quality seemed to favor the Catholic side. Don Juan del Aguila and his Spanish veterans fought with the skill and discipline expected of the famous tercios. Even in defeat, they carried themselves with dignity. The Irish, under Hugh O'Neill, had also reached the peak of their military development. They were deadly as raiders and skirmishers, and under O'Neill's leadership had grown into a far more organized and professional force. He had once fought for the crown himself and knew English tactics inside out. By the 1590s, he had introduced firearms into Irish warfare on a large scale, paying his marksmen higher wages than other infantry and arming his best troops with imported pikes from Spain. His men drilled, marched in formation, and even wore red coats, a sight almost unheard of among Gaelic troops before Clontibret. Yet despite these changes, their greatest strength remained in ambushes, rapid strikes, and hit-and-run attacks. When the English established a camp on Knockrabin Hill near Kinsale in October, their position was dangerously exposed. Without entrenchments or artillery in place, they faced several night raids from the Spaniards, who sallied out to harass them. One skirmish in the dark almost turned into a pitched battle before the Spaniards pulled back into the safety of the town. These encounters felt much like the wars of the Low Countries, a battlefield both sides knew well. The English pressed on, tightening their grip. By late October, they had begun to emulate continental siege warfare. Using stealth, small parties of English pikemen and sword and buckler men infiltrated Spanish outworks, copying the very tactics the Spaniards had perfected in trench fighting. Mountjoy adapted his plans constantly. At one moment he considered an all-out assault, then shifted to starving the garrison when threatened with relief from outside. He moved quickly where O'Neill hesitated, and within weeks had seized Rancoran Castle, a key fort guarding the harbor. Artillery fire from its walls now rained down on Kinsale itself, while the Spanish garrison tried to break the siege with furious sallies. On one occasion, English troops were caught out in the open and nearly crushed by musket volleys, but reinforcements arrived just in time. The back-and-forth fighting was relentless. By early November, Rincoran was firmly in English hands and became a gun platform. Still, the siege dragged on. In late November, Mountjoy brought forward more heavy guns and attempted to breach Kinsale's walls. The Spaniards resisted fiercely, repelling a major English attack on the 1st of December. Days later, in a daring night assault, about 1,500 Spaniards stormed the English trenches, overran a newly built fort, and spiked several cannons before withdrawing. Both sides claimed victory and exaggerated the other's losses, but in truth, each lost around 60 men. It was not a decisive breakthrough, yet it bought Aguila precious time in the hope that reinforcements from Spain might arrive. For Mountjoy, caution prevailed. He refused to risk another costly frontal attack. Instead, he would grind the Spaniards down through siege, waiting while his reinforcements gathered and his fleet held the harbor. For the defenders, the only hope was the arrival of a Spanish armada to smash the blockade and break the English stranglehold around Kinsale. At Castlehaven, 6 Spanish ships arrived carrying 1,000 fresh troops, artillery, and vital supplies. Yet instead of marching to Kinsale to join Aguila, their commander, General Zubior, pursued an over-ambitious plan. He wanted to scatter his men across several Irish strongholds and prepare for nothing less than an invasion of England. The result was disastrous. The reinforcements were divided, the artillery wasted, and Kinsale's garrison remained isolated. Sir Richard Levison's fleet eventually forced Zubior back, but the critical moment had passed. The chance for a decisive joint strike against Mountjoy was squandered. Meanwhile, O'Neill gathered around 6,000 infantry and 800 horse, joined by 250 Spaniards, and camped just 5 miles from Kinsale. Aguila urged him to act, promising that the garrison would sally out once the besiegers were engaged. But O'Neill hesitated. For 10 long days he waited, until Mountjoy's cannon threatened to breach the walls. Only then, with the siege tightening and time running out, did the Irish finally march. On the night of December 23rd, the Catholic army advanced in 3 bodies under O'Neill, O'Donnell, and Richard Tyrrell. Tyrrell's vanguard was meant to break through the English lines and signal the garrison to attack. But coordination collapsed before the battle even began. O'Donnell refused to march in the rearguard, throwing the order of battle into confusion. Worse still, O'Neill delayed until daylight, forfeiting the element of surprise. By dawn, Mountjoy's men were ready. When the Irish columns finally appeared, Mountjoy reacted instantly. He left infantry to guard the siege works and sent his cavalry, 3 regiments in 2 brigades, straight at O'Neill. English horse and foot clashed with the Irish in a running fight near a ford. The first English charge was beaten back, but the second, led by Wingfield and Sir Henry Power, struck with crushing effect. The Irish formation broke. Their cavalry fled, their infantry dissolved, and what began as a measured withdrawal turned into a rout. Tyrrell never reached his position, and Aguila's garrison, waiting for the signal to sally, remained pinned inside Kinsale. The collapse was total. The rear of the Irish force was cut down in retreat. The vanguard, scattered on a hilltop, was destroyed. Many of the Irish abandoned their Spanish allies, leaving them exposed. Aguila's brave troops stood firm but were overwhelmed. Casualties were immense. Of thousands who took the field, only a fraction escaped intact. For Aguila, it was a bitter end. His heroic sorties and stubborn defense had come to nothing, betrayed not by lack of courage, but by poor coordination with his allies. For the Irish, the blame lay with divided leadership and a failure to commit at the right moment. As historian Hayes McCoy judged, the immediate cause of defeat was simply the inability of O'Neill's main battle to stand against the English cavalry. Kinsale proved the worth of English arms at last. Cavalry charges, expertly coordinated with supporting infantry, shattered a superior enemy. Artillery was employed with skill, and the soldiers, though cold, hungry, and exhausted, stood their ground when it mattered most. The victory at Kinsale vindicated English military practice after years of costly defeats and uncertainty. To Elizabeth's chroniclers, the triumph was as miraculous as the defeat of the Armada in 1588. To their opponents, it marked the crushing of Ireland's greatest chance for freedom. Yet beyond the celebrations lay a sobering truth. England had survived, but only narrowly. Kinsale demonstrated that by the turn of the 17th century, English warfare had caught up with the military standards of continental Europe. But it also showed how fragile England's position remained, dependent on fortune, discipline, and the resolve of soldiers in the mud of a foreign land. In 1602, Sir Robert Cecil, one of Elizabeth's most skilled statesmen, remarked that the success of England's wider affairs, for the most part, depend upon the success of Ireland. He was not exaggerating. Ireland had become the keystone of England's, and soon Britain's, security. Half a century later, after the Great Rebellion of 1641, no one doubted how correct that judgment had been. The 9 Years' War had already demonstrated the strain. By 1601, maintaining the Irish army had cost the Crown more than £322,000 in a single year, a staggering sum that nearly bankrupted Elizabeth's government. At its peak, 19,000 English soldiers were deployed. Yet once peace came, James I immediately cut costs. The standing army of Ireland shrank to little more than 8,000 foot and 1,000 horse, and by 1606, the Lord Deputy, Sir Arthur Chichester, could count fewer than 1,200 professional troops under his command. To meet emergencies, he relied on improvised militias raised from his tenants and allies. These ad hoc bands, ranging from a few dozen to several hundred men, would march out provisioned by the local population, ready to fight Irish rebels in the woods and hills. Chichester himself was a soldier of continental experience. He had served at Cadiz and Amiens, earned a knighthood from Henry IV of France, and commanded garrisons at Ostend before being sent to Ireland under Essex. Rising quickly through the ranks, he became Sergeant Major General of the Irish Army, and eventually Lord Deputy. From hard-won experience, Chichester believed Ireland would never be subdued by raids or set-piece battles. Instead, victory lay in occupation, permanent garrisons, and administrative discipline. He applied the lessons of European warfare directly to Irish soil, making garrisons the backbone of Crown authority. But this military system was expensive to maintain. By 1607, a revolt in Ulster forced renewed expenditure, yet the Crown could not afford to restore Elizabeth's levels of commitment. Funding fell sharply after 1611, and by the reign of Charles I, the Irish establishment was once again dangerously under strength. Strategic priorities on the continent, first in Spain, then in France, drained resources away from Dublin Castle. Ironically, Charles's determination to fight Catholic powers in Europe led him to tolerate Irish Catholicism at home, granting concessions and greater autonomy, while expecting the Irish themselves to carry much of the cost of their own military security. By the late 1620s, settlers in Ulster were paying heavily for the upkeep of what amounted to a semi-permanent Irish army. Between 1628 and 1632, counties like Antrim and Down contributed nearly £7,000 towards its maintenance, a stark reminder that England's wars in Europe were shaping life, governance, and military organization in Ireland itself. Charles I's military administration in Ireland bore many similarities to the way he later managed the Bishops' Wars. Ambitious preparations were made, but rarely matched by the revenue needed to sustain them. The Crown faced constant financial strain. In the 1620s, Sir Thomas Wentworth of Yorkshire had been one of Buckingham's critics in Parliament. But after the Duke's assassination, Wentworth realigned politically and entered royal service. When Charles began his personal rule, Wentworth was given perhaps the most difficult task of all, the governorship of Ireland. In 1631, he became Lord Deputy, determined not only to secure the island, but also to balance its accounts. Against the odds, he succeeded. He raised revenue, reformed administration, and even managed to build a standing army that turned Ireland into a stronger part of England's strategic system. Wentworth's methods were thorough and uncompromising. He insisted that policies be enforced directly without being diluted by local elites. For the first time, Ireland began to provide a consistent dividend to the Crown's wider ambitions. Financial pressures were still immense. The declaration of war against Spain in 1625 had already forced Ireland to raise 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry out of its own resources. Even though income had doubled since 1611, reaching around £40,000 a year, expenditure outstripped revenue by as much as £50,000 annually. Wentworth inherited these problems, but he confronted them head-on. He kept potential Catholic uprisings under watch, and also eyed the Scottish settlers in Ulster, many of whom sympathized with the Covenanters across the water. To arm his forces properly, Wentworth turned to the Netherlands. Dutch gunsmiths, artillerists, and suppliers were more reliable and cheaper than English contractors. He authorized the casting of heavy pieces abroad, and even arranged for Dublin's civic metal stock to be melted down to save costs. His procurement system was meticulous, in stark contrast to Charles's habit of dispatching envoys to buy weapons in Hamburg or Flanders, often only to discover they were defective upon delivery. Wentworth stockpiled powder, saddles, horses, and all the accoutrements of a professional force. By 1639, he had assembled 7,000 infantry and 400 cavalry, fully equipped for deployment. Though the First Bishops' War never saw these Irish troops cross into Scotland, their existence demonstrated Wentworth's effectiveness. He had not only fielded a disciplined army, but had financed it largely through Irish income, a feat that earned him an English peerage as the Earl of Strafford. By 1640, he went even further, raising funds through the Irish Parliament and again sourcing arms from the Netherlands. Ireland, once a financial drain, now supplied men and material for the Crown's wider conflicts. This system continued even after Strafford left Dublin. Irish ordnance purchases were made independently, and Irish stockpiles were redirected to support campaigns on the Anglo-Scottish border. For a brief moment, Ireland had been transformed into a functional military base for the Stuart monarchy, a striking reversal of Elizabeth's era when English arms had to be shipped into Ireland at enormous cost. By the early 1640s, however, the outbreak of rebellion and the arrival of English forces would once again flip this balance, plunging the island into a new and devastating cycle of war. The management of Ireland's Ordnance Office, especially on the eve of the 1641 rebellion, showed just how vulnerable the system could be. Unlike its English counterpart, which was already notorious for inefficiency, the Irish office was even more prone to corruption, sinecures, and private profiteering. The system of scattered garrison depots made matters worse, decentralizing supply and complicating accountability. At a time when discipline and oversight were most needed, control of the ordnance itself was unsettled. In 1640, Sir John Borlase, who held the office of Master of the Ordnance by royal patent, entered into negotiations to share the position with Sir Thomas Lucas, a seasoned veteran of the Low Countries. The arrangement promised profit on both sides, but as the two families haggled, Ireland's artillery and munitions supply suffered from neglect. Lucas even sought advice from the imprisoned Strafford, but with the Lord Lieutenant's fate uncertain, he hesitated to commit money. In the end, Borlase became a Lord Justice, while Lucas assumed the mastership, though only by abandoning his other office as Commissary General of the Horse, which the king himself had deemed questionable. At the very moment England and Scotland were spiraling into conflict, Irish administration was distracted by these disputes. The bishops' wars exposed how weak Charles's grasp over Ireland had become, just as Scotland slipped from his control and unrest spread across England. Strafford had built in Ireland what Charles lacked at home: a disciplined, professional army. His reforms replaced outdated arquebuses with muskets, expanded the use of artillery, and regularized pay and equipment. He demanded strict inspections, drilling troops in his own presence, and forbade plunder, insisting his soldiers be properly supplied with money for food. To Strafford, the army was more than a fighting force. It was an instrument of government, a centralized power that could enforce royal writs and keep both Protestant settlers and Irish Catholics in check. This vision of a standing army, professional and obedient, terrified Parliament. To Strafford's enemies, it looked less like reform and more like tyranny enforced by the sword. Charges of treason accused him of plotting to subdue Ireland by force and to extend that same iron discipline into England. When Strafford crossed the Irish Sea in 1639–40 at Charles's command, he carried with him not just political authority, but also the specter of his Irish army, one of the most capable military forces of the early Stuart era. Reports from Carrickfergus in 1640 spoke admiringly of well-dressed, disciplined soldiers, a far cry from the ragged levies of earlier decades. 8,000 foot and 1,000 horse, trained and equipped to continental standards, stood ready for deployment. The irony was stark. For centuries, England had poured resources into Ireland, feeding garrisons that consumed endless supplies. Now, for the first time, Ireland was producing a force so effective that it could have tipped the balance in the bishops' wars. Strafford envisioned sending his Irish army into Yorkshire, a reversal of history, for English troops had always been sent to Ireland, never the other way around. To his supporters, Strafford might have salvaged Charles's failing cause against the Scots. To his enemies, the thought of Irish soldiers marching on English soil embodied the very nightmare of royal absolutism. Had Strafford lived, it is doubtful the rebellion of 1641 would have broken out unchecked. He had the will, the discipline, and the army to crush it with ruthless efficiency. But with his execution, Ireland lost its strongest governor, and Charles lost the one commander who had managed to turn the island from a logistical drain into a genuine base of power. On the 22nd of October, 1641, rebellion erupted in Ulster. The following day, insurgents tried and failed to seize Dublin itself. By 26th October, Sir Phelim O'Neill had secured Armagh, and within weeks rebel forces sacked Mellifont and laid siege to Drogheda. The Royal Army, now under the command of Ormond as Lieutenant General, faced its first major test. At Julianstown, a column sent to relieve Drogheda was ambushed and destroyed. 500 English infantry, well-trained and well-armed, were cut down by rebels who had little more than courage and crude weapons. Not a single foot soldier survived. The Irish seized their arms and ammunition, a victory that sent shockwaves through the countryside and emboldened the rising. Friars fanned the flames, telling the rebels God had delivered the English into their hands. Some boasted that when Ireland was cleansed, they would cross the sea and rid England of its name as well. Loyalist reports described the massacre as a turning point. Rebel clans, like the O'Reillys, gloried in their triumph, claiming it had united the Pale and all Ireland behind them. English officers suspected treachery within their own ranks, with native Irish soldiers deserting at the moment of crisis. yet garrisons like Drogheda held firm. Sir Henry Tichborne insisted his companies were full, his men eager and the majority Protestant. But beneath the optimism, the Crown faced a familiar problem: an army too small, too poorly supplied, and too divided by religion to withstand a nationwide rebellion. From the Catholic perspective, the rebellion was a war of survival. With the victories of the Scottish Covenanters and an increasingly hostile English Parliament, Irish Catholics feared for both their faith and their lives. Taking up arms was framed as both religious defense and national liberation. The savagery of the Elizabethan Wars returned with new intensity. The rebels claimed they fought to protect Catholicism, uphold the king's prerogative, and defend the liberties of the Irish nation. Parliament, meanwhile, moved swiftly to respond. A volunteer force of 8,000 men was proposed, with another 10,000 Scots to join them in crushing the rebellion. For the first time, a parliamentary committee assumed control of military preparations for Ireland, limiting the authority of the royalist Earl of Leicester, the nominal Lord Lieutenant. Charles tried to retain influence by supporting Ormond in his command, but the balance of power was shifting. The financial strain was immense. By late 1640, Ireland's army cost £1,000 a day. Even garrisoned, it drained £6,000 in the opening months of 1641. Memories of the 1590s loomed large as English forces again tried to march relief columns across hostile ground, burning and plundering as they went. Garrisoning had always been cheaper, but cash-strapped Stuarts neglected even that, leaving strongholds undermanned and vulnerable. Worse still, the army in Ireland was largely Protestant-led, but contained Catholic soldiers, a fact that unnerved both king and parliament. Should such an army be armed and trusted, or might it turn its weapons elsewhere? Supplies were critical. Artillery, gunpowder, shoes, and wagons meant survival. Ormond pressed for immediate action, using the stockpiles Strafford had built for the Bishops' Wars, hoping artillery and disciplined companies could break rebel lines. But delays gave the insurgents time to arm themselves. Weapons flooded into rebel hands, sometimes seized in battle, other times handed over by panicked loyalists who later found those same muskets aimed back at them. In 1642, as civil war spread to England, Ireland was already burning. 36,000 Protestant troops were scattered across the island, short of food, clothes, and ammunition. Rebel forces, meanwhile, grew stronger by capturing enemy weapons, feeding themselves off the land, and turning English arms against their former owners. Protestant commanders bitterly joked that their men would have to kill rebels with jawbones just to arm themselves from the spoils. Guerrilla tactics gave the Irish the edge. But the great question remained: could Gaelic warfare adapt to the demands of continental siegecraft, the modern face of war? When Phelim O'Neill set his sights on Drogheda, he did so without the heavy guns needed for a proper siege. He posted men in nearby villages and looked for weak points in the town's defenses, focusing on a crumbling wall where, with little more than pickaxes, an opening might be forced. A night attack was attempted, but poor coordination ruined the plan. The alarm was raised before the gate could be forced, and the defenders drove the rebels back with pikes and cavalry. Without artillery, O'Neill's army could do little more than harass the town, while the garrison occasionally sallied out to seize cattle and grain. When Ormond arrived with reinforcements, he scattered the rebel outposts in a brief fight and wanted to press into Ulster to crush the revolt at its root. Other loyalist commanders struck out on their own. On 27 November 1641, Colonel Sir Charles Coote, marched with 500 infantry and 50 horse to relieve Castle Wicklow. His men left a trail of terror. Suspected spies were hanged, and even civilians were executed. Coote himself killed a captured rebel with his pistol, setting the brutal tone that would mark much of the conflict. On the return march, his column was shadowed by 1,000 Irish under Luke O'Toole. In a narrow lane flanked by bog and woodland, the rebels attacked with a fierce shout, briefly throwing the English into disorder. But Coote rallied his men, gained higher ground, and unleashed disciplined musket fire. The Irish broke and scattered into bog and forest. Coote pressed on, fighting again at Kilcoole on the 1st of December, and later storming Santry and Clontarf. By the turn of 1642, Protestant forces appeared to be holding their ground. The defense of Drogheda held firm. Coote's raid spread fear, and the arrival of Sir Simon Harcourt with 1,100 fresh troops boosted morale. Government forces, together with 4,000 Ulster volunteers, fielded several thousand reasonably trained men. More reinforcements followed from England, like George Monk's 1,500 infantry in February. But every new regiment brought fresh logistical headaches. Troops had to be billeted, fed, and supplied in a land already ravaged by war. Horses had to be accounted for, carriages built, and storehouses filled with corn and hay. Money was scarce, disputes over rations common, and theft widespread. Still, victories followed. Coote struck again and again until he was killed outside Trim in May 1642. Ormond, meanwhile, led 3,000 infantry and 500 cavalry from Dublin in April to retake key castles and towns in Kildare and Carlow. His force, burdened with wagons of food and ammunition, was weary and reduced in number, yet near Kilrush they found themselves facing a rebel host of 6,000 to 8,000, entrenched on commanding ground. Ormond knew the risk. To attack uphill against superior numbers could destroy his army and the Dublin government's last hope. Yet the rebels' position was so close to the road that he had no choice but to fight. He arranged his men in 2 lines with a reserve, placing artillery along the lane and firelocks behind them. Musketeers advanced, firing volleys that drew the rebels' attention, while Ormond's cavalry suddenly swept in on the flank. The Irish lines wavered, some falling back into boggy ground. Sensing an opening, rebel commanders tried to seize the English baggage and guns, but Ormond countered with volunteer horse and 300 infantry. Fierce fighting followed, but the English prevailed. The Irish left collapsed under cavalry charges, and soon their right wing followed, fleeing in disorder. Around 700 rebels were killed, most during the rout. The victory at Kilrush proved that even a smaller, strained government force could beat superior numbers with discipline, artillery, and clever coordination of cavalry and musketeers. It was a hard-won success in a war that was only just beginning. In May 1642, Sir William St. Leger wrote from Cork describing a dire situation. Reinforcements bound for Ireland were recalled back to London as the rift between Charles I and Parliament deepened. What had begun as a rebellion was by now the largest war Ireland had ever endured. Both sides desperately sought weapons from Britain, while also turning to the arms markets of continental Europe, seasoned by decades of the 30 Years' War. By the late summer of 1642, Loyalist forces, made up of English, Scottish, and Irish supporters, had gathered as many as 36,000 men to crush the revolt. Yet the Battle of Edgehill in October shifted priorities. Civil war had erupted in England itself, and soldiers once destined for Ireland were needed at home. The timing was disastrous. Without fresh supplies of money, powder, and shot, Loyalist operations in Ireland faltered. Captain Tucker lamented the state of Sir Francis Willoughby's army. 1,500 infantry, many without shoes, cavalry in even worse condition, and artillery barely functional. He admitted he could hardly bear to remain in the field, ashamed that England's name was dishonored by sending men so ill-equipped. And yet, in the autumn of 1642, Loyalist forces had been winning battles. Inchiquin secured victories in Cork and triumphed at Bandon Bridge, while elsewhere English commanders forced rebels onto the defensive. But with civil war now raging in England, support dwindled. Conditions in garrisons deteriorated rapidly. Soldiers at Naas survived for weeks on little more than 3 pounds of biscuit, leaving them starving and restless. At Duncannon, discipline collapsed entirely when one captain locked away his men's rations for himself, forcing his governor to break down the door to feed the company. Scenes like these echoed the struggles of earlier Irish wars, when logistics and supply often determined the outcome more than courage in the field. For both Crown and Parliament, Ireland was more than a rebellion. It was part of a wider struggle between Protestant and Catholic power across Europe. A secure Ireland meant the survival of Protestant England, and by extension, the Dutch Republic. The decisive clash at Kinsale decades earlier had resembled the great sieges of the Low Countries, proof that the English had mastered continental methods of war. Yet Ireland was always different. The rugged terrain, the difficulty of supply, and the constant threat of ambush made it unlike fighting in Flanders or Scotland. Irish tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes on marching columns, and sudden raids remained effective whenever Gaelic forces combined discipline with their knowledge of the land. By mid-1642, Ireland had already witnessed campaigns on a scale not seen since Kinsale, even before England had fully descended into civil war. To end the story, there risks an Anglo-centric perspective, for the Irish struggle continued fiercely throughout the decade. But one lesson is clear. English arms only triumphed in Ireland when the war was given full priority, supported with the money, supplies, and leadership required. That was true in 1601 at Kinsale, and would be proven again in 1649. On 23rd March 1603, as a Brabantine corporal named Hans Hume was executed at Ostend for murdering his sergeant, Queen Elizabeth I also passed away. For historians, this marks a convenient boundary between the Tudor and Stuart eras. Yet for soldiers in the trenches, the change of monarch meant little. English troops held their ground at Ostend in 1603, just as they had in 1601, proof that the art of war was learned and practiced abroad, unaffected by dynastic shifts at home. Even in 1605, English soldiers were still defending Protestant strongholds in the Low Countries, and at Bergen op Zoom, they repelled a daring night attack by 5,000 Spanish infantry, supported by cavalry, who attempted to storm 3 gates at once. With women and children helping to barricade the entrances, the garrison barely held, but hold they did. The early Stuart years are often called a time of peace, but Europe told a different story. The War of Succession over Cleves and Jülich between 1610 and 1614 drew Britain into the vortex of dynastic and religious struggle. James I, though officially at peace, dispatched troops to aid Nassau, and English volunteer companies fought in Denmark's war against Sweden from 1611 to 1613. The flow of Englishmen into continental armies never ceased. By 1614, Sir Horace Vere commanded 29 English companies, while John Ogle, Edward Cecil, and Charles Morgan led others, men who would all play prominent roles in later campaigns. Even as James sought disengagement, his soldiers remained tied to allies in the Netherlands and Germany, beyond his easy recall. By the mid-1620s, England was drawn back into open conflict. The 30 Years' War had erupted in 1618, and failed expeditions soon followed. The attempt to relieve the Palatinate in 1621, the defense of Bergen-op-Zoom in 1622, the Mansfeld expedition in 1624–25, and Charles's later support for Denmark. Charles justified intervention as a defensive necessity, warning that without action Spain and the Empire might dominate all of Germany, threatening British trade and security. In 1625 came the Cadiz expedition, conceived as a bold strike against Iberia, echoing Elizabethan ventures. But it was a flawed policy, poorly executed. Charles himself visited Plymouth to review the fleet, knight captains, and inspire morale. But he and Buckingham had failed to set clear objectives. The army of 10,000 infantry and 5,000 sailors sailed without knowing whether they were to attack Cadiz, intercept the treasure fleet, or strike elsewhere. Their commander, Sir Edward Cecil, lacked decisiveness, and his vague sailing orders only deepened confusion. At Cadiz, the English briefly repeated the glories of 1596, when Essex led the charge into the bay, catching the Spaniards off guard. But hesitation squandered the chance for a swift victory. Cecil dithered over landing points, and Fort Puntal became the focus of a costly assault. Dutch gunners performed effectively, but English colliers and pressed ships caused chaos, even firing on their own flotilla. When English troops finally landed, they did so under Spanish fire and with heavy losses. Though the fort was battered into submission, Cecil quickly lost his nerve on hearing that a Spanish relief force was approaching. Without reconnaissance or rations, he marched his men inland, hungry, exhausted, and leaderless. The Cadiz campaign collapsed into failure, remembered not for courage in battle, but for poor leadership and squandered opportunity. Cecil's march inland during the Cadiz expedition soon descended into chaos, remembered less for military success than for drunken disorder. Because of confusion during the landing, many supplies remained on the ships. Soldiers set out without food in their knapsacks, and hunger quickly spread through the ranks. Thirst became an even greater problem until they stumbled upon a massive stockpile of wine, hundreds of barrels hidden away. The men drank deeply on empty stomachs, and discipline collapsed. Some grew so intoxicated that order had to be restored by smashing the casks, yet soldiers still scooped wine from the ground with their hands and hats. One company became so unruly that Cecil's own guards even opened fire on their fellow countrymen. In the end, when the march resumed the next day, many drunken stragglers were left behind, only to be cut down by the Spaniards as they slept. Critics later pointed to every possible reason for the disaster: poor logistics, lack of planning, bad recruitment, and, above all, Cecil's failure as a commander. He himself admitted that his men were so addicted to drink that even those sent to guard the wine would end up drunk first. For Parliament in 1626, Cadiz became a symbol of England's military weakness. Vast sums had been wasted, more than £373,000 on the expedition alone, while new threats from Spain, the Empire, and Catholic Europe loomed. Charles promised money and troops for allies such as Denmark, but without parliamentary cooperation, these pledges collapsed in embarrassment. If Cadiz exposed feeble leadership, the expedition to the Isle of Rey in 1627 revealed the dangers of headstrong command. This time, the Duke of Buckingham took personal charge, determined to silence his critics and win glory in arms. He gathered nearly 6,000 infantry, officers drawn largely from his own circle, and sailed from Portsmouth in June. Survivors of Cadiz, bitter from years of poor billeting, were among the ranks, including John Felton, who would later assassinate the Duke. Money for rations and equipment was scarce, yet Buckingham lavished thousands of pounds on his personal retinue and showy displays of wealth. The landing at Rey began well with a carefully chosen site, but once again execution was sloppy. Troops were slow to form up, no patrols were sent forward, and during those wasted hours the French garrison slipped into position behind the dunes. When the English at last began to advance, they were struck by a fierce cavalry charge. For a moment the entire landing seemed doomed, with soldiers forced to fight in confusion or drown, retreating into the sea. Yet the English managed to stand firm, repelling the horsemen and eventually driving back the French infantry. The Duke himself, sword in hand from his barge, urged the men forward, rallying scattered units into order. Against the odds, the English held the field and inflicted heavy losses. It was a dramatic moment, but the larger campaign would falter. Logistics once again determined the outcome. Supplies ran short, discipline suffered, and when the French managed to resupply their citadel, the chance of victory slipped away. The Isle of Rey, like Cadiz before it, showed how England's ambitions in continental war outstripped its preparation and leadership. Buckingham had sought triumph to secure his position at court, but instead he returned home defeated, his reputation tarnished, and his enemies in Westminster more determined than ever. Buckingham's decision to besiege the citadel on the Isle of Rey proved to be one of the most fateful choices of his career. Despite his officers' urging caution, he pressed on, driven as much by personal honor as by strategy. Once the town of St. Martin's was secured, the trenches and earthworks crept forward. The Duke alternated between bombarding the fortress, digging mines beneath its walls, and occasionally threatening an all-out assault. Supplies were scarce, tempers short, and the French garrison, commanded by the able Toiras, proved stubborn and resourceful. For a time, it seemed that the English might starve the defenders into submission. But in September, under cover of night, French vessels broke through the blockade and delivered desperately needed provisions. The next morning, the garrison mocked the besiegers by raising chickens and turkeys on their pikes in open defiance. From that moment, the siege began to slip from English hands. Buckingham still hoped for a breakthrough. He planned surprise assaults, but rain, exhaustion, and poor coordination sabotaged his efforts. When he finally ordered a frontal attack on the citadel, the result was catastrophic. Scaling ladders proved too short, artillery support was missing, and the defenders hurled stones, logs, and barrels from the walls. Hundreds of English soldiers were cut down in the chaos. With morale shattered and reinforcements arriving from the French mainland, retreat became inevitable. The withdrawal was even more disastrous than the failed assault. As the English force pulled back across a narrow dike, the French cavalry struck. In the crush of men and horses, order collapsed. Many were trampled or driven into the salt marshes, where they drowned. Regiments broke apart, commanders were killed, and thousands were slaughtered or captured. The Isle of Rey campaign ended in calamity, mirroring the Cadiz expedition 2 years earlier. Both ventures revealed the same fatal flaws: poor planning, confused landings, lack of reliable intelligence, and a failure to supply and reinforce the troops properly. In both cases, the enemy was given precious time to regroup and resist. Above all, they highlighted the dangers of leadership that relied on impulse and honor rather than clear strategy. For Buckingham, these failures not only ruined military reputations, but also deepened resentment at home, where critics pointed to his ambition and mismanagement as symbols of England's weakness abroad. The military disasters of the 1620s cast a long shadow over England's confidence in war. Failures abroad not only tarnished the reputation of the crown, but also shook the nation's belief in its own fighting strength. Parliament, recalling the examples of ancient Rome, sometimes likened Charles Victor's soldiers to dangerous Praetorian bands, or even to Ottoman janissaries, symbols of armies corrupted by politics and ambition. Others, turning to religion for explanations, claimed that defeats were God's judgment upon the kingdom. As one member of Parliament declared, if the Lord was not fighting England's battles, then no human effort could prevail. Yet there were voices of encouragement, too. In 1629, a Somerset clergyman reminded his countrymen of past glories, the victories of Sir John Norris in the Low Countries, the daring of Drake and Hawkins at sea, and the legendary names of the Veres and Lord Grey. England, he argued, was inferior to no nation when it came to courage. These appeals kept alive a proud martial memory, even as the present seemed marked by failure. Charles himself felt the sting of dishonor deeply. After the disaster at the Isle of Rey, he reportedly went 2 days without food, grieving his loss of prestige. Determined to restore confidence, he sought to make his own presence the unifying symbol of royal military power. Plans were laid for musters of cavalry, and the king often appeared in person to rally his soldiers. But warfare required more than symbolism. It needed Parliament's cooperation. This remained elusive. Many MPs favored cheaper and less risky ventures, piracy, privateering, and the pursuit of trade, rather than costly continental campaigns. The memory of the 30 Years' War, however, ensured that some support still flowed toward the Protestant cause. Subsidies were granted, though often reluctantly and with strict conditions. When Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629, he removed the main channel through which war could be waged collectively. From then on, England withdrew from large-scale intervention, leaving allies to fight without her. Even so, English soldiers were far from idle. Thousands continued to serve abroad under foreign banners. In 1630, 4 English regiments reinforced the Dutch, raising the number of English troops in their service to nearly 10,000. The following year, the Marquis of Hamilton led 6,000 English and 1,000 Scots to fight alongside Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. Officially, Charles distanced himself from these campaigns, but they preserved a reservoir of English military skill that could one day be called upon at home. The Siege of Maastricht in 1632 is a telling example. English units fought alongside their Dutch allies, manning trenches, building works, and facing desperate night assaults. One English officer, mortally wounded in a clash of pikes and musket fire, symbolized the cost of keeping England's military edge alive on foreign soil. Service abroad allowed soldiers and officers alike to gain the battlefield experience that the Crown itself was unwilling or unable to provide. By the mid-1630s, England's formal role in the wars of religion had diminished, but its manpower still mattered. At one point, English soldiers made up as much as a third of the Dutch army. Others, including Irish and recusant English, even fought for Catholic powers. This strange duality meant that while England's monarch pulled back from official war, his subjects continued to shape the struggles of Europe. At sea, Charles dreamed of a different legacy. Ship money funded an ambitious naval program, culminating in the magnificent Sovereign of the Seas, a vessel that declared England's intention to rule the waves. The king personally inspected dockyards and minted medals to celebrate this maritime strength. Yet these resources too often bled away into land wars, with failed expeditions draining funds that could have sustained a powerful fleet. In the end, it was not foreign enemies who would test English arms, but domestic ones. By the late 1630s, the kingdom's greatest military trial was no longer in Cadiz or on the Isle of Rey, nor even in the trenches of the Low Countries, but within its own borders. By the late 1630s, England certainly possessed the knowledge needed for war. Military manuals were available, and many veterans who had fought on the continent were eager to offer their expertise. Writers like John Crusoe, Henry VIII, and Robert Ward produced treatises that blended foreign experience with English traditions, drawing on lessons from campaigns in the Netherlands and earlier Elizabethan conflicts. Siegecraft, in particular, was well understood. English soldiers had gained valuable training in places such as Breda and Ostend, where entire generations had learned the hard realities of modern warfare. Pamphleteers and chroniclers made sure the public knew of these exploits, proudly recounting English contributions to Protestant victories abroad. Yet Charles I's court showed little interest in this body of knowledge. Poetry and drama held greater appeal than military science, and few of the king's closest advisors were experienced soldiers. Had Charles paid more attention to the warnings of men like Crusoe, who advised rulers to count their resources carefully before embarking on war, he might have avoided the disasters that followed. Ironically, while English troops fought for Protestant causes across Europe, Charles was preparing to turn his armies against fellow Protestants in Scotland. The spark came in 1637, when the imposition of a new prayer book provoked fierce resistance in lowland Scotland. By 1639, the king was raising forces to subdue his northern kingdom. This marked a dramatic reversal of English strategy. Instead of fighting Catholic enemies abroad, Charles contemplated cooperation with Catholic Spain while preparing to wage war on Calvinist Scots. Many in England were bewildered. Some believed the so-called Bishops' Wars were merely an excuse to raise money, just as earlier levies like ship money had been justified in the name of defense. Mobilization exposed deep problems. The trained bands, local militias meant for home defense, were now pressed into service as expeditionary troops. On paper, Charles could muster 12,000 infantry and a few hundred horse, but enthusiasm was lacking. Reports told of men paying others to take their place rather than march north. Even the nobility, traditionally the backbone of royal armies, sent apologies and modest sums of money instead of appearing in person. The war effort lacked unity and conviction. The contrast with earlier generations was striking. The borders, once bristling with defenses during the days of raids and rebellions, had long been quiet. Now, after decades of neglect, they were hurriedly revived in preparation for a conflict that felt out of place in the modern age. Meanwhile, Charles courted Spanish diplomats, indulged his Catholic queen, and even sought financial help from Rome, actions that further alienated his Protestant subjects. Thus, when war finally came, it seemed not a campaign of national defense, but an unnecessary quarrel between a king and his own people. The Bishops' Wars revealed just how far Charles had drifted from both the traditional enemies of England and the confidence of his nation. What should have been a show of royal strength instead exposed weakness, hesitation, and a failure to grasp the true art of war. By the early 1640s, England's northern defenses were in disarray. Carlisle Castle, abandoned by its garrison in 1621, had fallen into ruin until Henry Clifford, using his own funds, began restoring its strength. Across Cumberland and Westmoreland, local militia units started drilling again in 1638, but their situation was difficult. These were remote, mountainous counties with few gunsmiths, armorers, or wagon makers, and their numbers were small. Even so, under Clifford's leadership and the efforts of deputies like Sir Philip Musgrave, troops were moved with surprising speed. At Appleby and Kendal, stockpiled ammunition, much of it imported from the Low Countries, provided a rare advantage. Within days, regiments were marching into position, showing that local initiative could still compensate for royal neglect. Further east, Newcastle faced a similar challenge. Its medieval defenses were decayed, its militia numbered only a few hundred, and the town had no gunsmiths or armorers to maintain weapons. Plans were drawn up to place culverins on the ramparts and mount smaller pieces taken from naval vessels, while residents promised that, if armed, they could field thousands of citizens in an emergency. Still, the reality was bleak. Shortages of food, poor fortifications, and a reliance on the king's resources meant Newcastle's survival depended less on local strength than on royal intervention. When Scottish forces occupied the city in September 1640, those fears were proven right. The king's army, encamped on the borders in 1639, numbered around 20,000 men. But while Charles had once envisioned an army nearly twice that size, financial strain forced him to compromise. Mobilization was slow, supplies inadequate, and no subsidies came from Parliament. At Kelso, the Earl of Holland confronted the Scots but hesitated to attack without infantry support. His opponent, Alexander Leslie, a veteran of the 30 Years' War, used cunning tactics, spreading his ranks thin, flying numerous banners, and even driving cattle to raise clouds of dust, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. The trick worked. Unsure of what he faced, Holland withdrew. England could have pressed harder in 1639, but money and organization were lacking. War costs soared. Arming and feeding even 25,000 men could approach £1 million, far beyond the crown's limited income. Payments for wages alone involved a maze of transactions across the exchequer, and funds had to be found for every corner of the kingdom. Irish contingents under Strafford, Scottish garrisons, English fortifications, and the Navy. The logistical hub was Kingston upon Hull, where arms and artillery were stockpiled. Yet delays in transport meant that heavy guns never reached the front. At Newburn Ford in 1640, when the Scots crossed into England, English defenders lacked proper artillery and were swept aside. The Bishops' Wars revealed not only the limits of Charles's finances, but also his failures as commander-in-chief. Poorly supplied, badly paid, and scattered across weak positions, his troops were no match for the disciplined Scottish veterans they faced. Administrative chaos, coupled with the king's own indecision, left England vulnerable. And in the end, it was not victory abroad, but defeat at home, that forced Charles to summon the Long Parliament and set the stage for civil war. The defeat at Newburn in 1640 sent shockwaves across England, leaving scars that reminded many of earlier military failures in the late 1500s. The Royal Army never recovered after its retreat from the Tyne, and wounded men like Thomas Snook of Sutton Mandeville, whose head injury was so severe that surgeons removed pieces of his skull, returned home as grim symbols of a faltering war effort. Communities that had already grown weary of forced recruitment and billeting now faced the return of broken soldiers, deepening resentment toward the Crown's military policies. Despite possessing a militia that, on paper, numbered nearly 100,000 men, England itself had been forced to endure occupation by foreign troops. The king's reputation, briefly bolstered by his naval projects, collapsed with the defeats of 1639 and 1640. Reports even circulated that some militia units refused orders from officers suspected of Catholic sympathies, a mutiny fueled by Charles's unpopular religious policies. While loyal figures like Henry Clifford did their best to strengthen local defenses, many counties, like Lincolnshire, showed open reluctance. When Parliament's militia ordinance called men to muster in 1642, most appeared without hesitation in open defiance of the king. Charles may be remembered today through Van Dyck's majestic equestrian portraits, which present him as a refined and commanding ruler, but his military record told another story. Obsessed with dynastic honor, he had thrown England into costly expeditions during the 1620s and pressed forward into the Bishops' Wars with little real preparation. His failure as a commander emboldened conspirators in 1641 to plot a coup, aiming to seize the Tower of London and overawe Parliament. By January 1642, when Charles personally marched soldiers into Westminster in a failed attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament, it was clear that he trusted the sword more than the law. For him, loyalty to the crown outweighed loyalty to country, a view rooted in ideas of monarchy that echoed imperial Rome and medieval feudalism. As England drifted into civil war, it became evident that Charles had turned English arms against his own subjects. From the early 1500s to 1642, English warfare had been shaped by the unique predicament of an island nation, one that constantly had to defend itself against potential invasion. This required flexibility, an ability to adapt foreign tactics and technologies to local needs. The English had perfected longbow warfare, then embraced gunpowder, artillery, cavalry charges, amphibious assaults, and even guerrilla tactics in Ireland. They learned siegecraft in the Low Countries, fought cavalry battles in France, and became masters of naval firepower in their struggle against Spain. What made the English art of war distinct was not a single weapon or tactic, but a culture of adaptability. From logistics, securing horses, wagons, food, and powder, to innovations in naval gunnery such as lidded gun ports and lighter cannon, they constantly borrowed from Europe and reshaped those lessons to suit their own strategic needs. Veterans and officers carried experience from one theater to another, ensuring that England remained connected to the great conflicts of the age. Even military finance reflected this adaptability. By the reign of Henry VIII, more efficient accounting systems streamlined the vast sums required to maintain armies and fleets, much like merchants adopting double-entry bookkeeping. This ability to learn, absorb, and innovate in both war and commerce gave England resilience. Before the rise of empire, it was this eclectic, flexible approach, forged through centuries of conflict, that defined the English art of war. Even when England branded change as a return to old ways, Parliament's slow, stop-start usefulness and the flexibility of the law helped build a state that, by the late 1600s, could field armies larger than anything seen since the 100 Years' War. Medieval habits didn't vanish. They lingered in plain sight. From 1511 to 1642, monarchs still assumed that courtiers, officers, and royal servants would take up arms when called. Henry VIII's household treated this as normal, and a century later, during the Bishops' Wars, that assumption still held. You can see how deep it ran in 1569, when Elizabeth I's own household mustered a strange, mixed formation: demi-lances and light horse, corsleted pikemen and halberdiers, arquebusiers, archers, and billmen, even staff from the pantry, the spicery, the laundry, and the scullery turning out as soldiers. They didn't form one neat unit. The household mirrored the realm's old military patchwork. That mindset was feudal at its core. And traces of it endured. A crossbow maker still plying his trade in 1573. The early Stuarts buying tilt armor long after the joust had faded into courtly memory. Charles I revived medieval dues like scutage, and Parliament searched medieval precedent for constitutional ammunition. We like to tell tidy stories of progress, one weapon eclipsing another, one system replacing the old. But early modern England didn't live in a straight line. Much thinking remained cyclical, a universe ordered by a great chain of being, where elites were naturally the masters of war, and the ultimate textbooks were classical Rome and Greece. English humanists justified Protestant survival by leaning on that antique authority. Soldiering itself often felt timeless. Veterans wandered from theater to theater. Methods traveled with them. To many eyes, the tercios looked like legions reborn, Swiss pikes like a Macedonian phalanx in new clothes. Painters began to wrestle with historical accuracy, yet even in Altdorfer's famed Battle of Issus, 1529, ancient Persians wear the faces of 16th century foes, a world halfway between myth and reportage. English writers did something similar with weapons. Sir John Smythe defended the longbow not as nostalgia, but as a universal equalizer. Egyptian, Persian, Moorish, English, an arm that humbled princes from Saul to Alexander. In this view, victory came less from technology than from virtue and discipline. The Roman ideal. National bragging rights were part of the air. An anecdote from Antwerp has a Captain Maria sneering at English bravery, only to face Smythe's litany, Poitiers, Hawkwood in Italy, Richard Lionheart on Cyprus, and a challenge to settle it by the sword. For both men, the real measure was character, courage, steadiness, moral fiber. Yet gunpowder was changing the craft, even if not every veteran explained it cleanly. Artillery offered decisive blows, then demanded heavy trains, roads, fodder, and specialized crews that slowed everything down. The military revolution was less a single leap than a tangle of projectiles, formations, and countermeasures layered onto older habits. Smythe's famous bow versus gun polemic captured the messiness. It wasn't only about kit. It touched raw nerves, dead pay abuses, impressment and training, court favoritism, and the erosion of local autonomy. He accused some officers of reckless glory hunting to profit from dead men's wages, language incendiary enough to force rebuttals from Sir Roger Williams and other professionals. Morality and method blurred into one angry argument. Crucially, Smythe did not call for banning firearms. Like Captain Edward York writing from the siege of Rouen, he wanted natural weapons that needed little drilling, bows, pikes, balanced against infernal machines that demanded real skill and better leadership. His point, often misread, was synthesis. Keep the bow where it still excelled, integrate pike, and use muskets properly rather than fashionably. On the other side, Humphrey Barwick, another veteran whose career began in 1548, leaned into the new discipline and claimed that the best contemporary practice now surpassed the ancients. That, in the end, is the English pattern. Not a clean break, but an elastic blend. Feudal obligation beside parliamentary finance. Roman virtue preached while matchlocks crack. Longbows loosed next to pikes dressed for a musket volley. Change arrived wearing the clothes of tradition, and the army that emerged could fight bigger, longer, and more complex wars than the medieval realm ever had. The survival of the longbow in English armies was never simply a sign of being outdated. Instead, it reflected the eclectic nature of English warfare, where bows and firearms were used side by side because each had unique strengths and weaknesses. Henry VIII himself understood that guns offered penetration and power, while bows had speed and lower cost. The solution was to use both, arquebusiers alongside archers, an approach that kept bowmen on English battlefields well into the 1600s. Yet the longbow's position remained uncertain. In 1631, Charles I briefly revived Henry's archery laws, only to abandon them within a few months as unrealistic. Maintaining consistency required real training, something difficult to enforce across the country. Under James I, militia standards varied wildly, leading the Crown to issue a national drill book in 1623. Veterans of the Low Countries wars were even brought home and stationed in pairs across the shires to train local men. But whether this succeeded depended less on royal initiative than on cooperation from below. Some towns, like Shrewsbury, paid their mustermasters diligently, while others, such as parts of Somerset, resisted or fell into arrears. Local rivalries and personal quarrels often undermined wider military organization. Many county leaders saw military duties as a nuisance, or even a threat to their standing, and national defense suffered for it. This reluctance was not confined to the Stuarts. Even in Elizabeth's time, with enemies on several fronts, some communities failed to take their responsibilities seriously. At Whitehall, the bigger picture of national security was clear, but local landowners often dismissed the Crown's warnings as exaggerated or self-serving. Both Henry VIII's costly wars and James I's naive hopes for peace undermined royal credibility, making it harder for monarchs to mobilize the country. The truth was that accurate information was hard to gather, enforcement was inconsistent, and local traditions carried more weight than royal orders. What kept England free was the strength of local independence, yet that same independence nearly left the realm dangerously exposed. England was never a militarized society. Unlike many continental states, the English did not embrace war as part of their culture. Military power before 1642 still rested in the countryside, with local lords, resources, and money. Royal armies existed only with cooperation from these local powers and through creative financing. Henry VIII's campaigns, for example, relied on church lands and a compliant parliament. Elizabeth perfected the balance by working through the lieutenancy, handing responsibility to trusted nobles who could blend local and royal interests. What emerged was not a centralized military machine, but a patchwork system that functioned through negotiation and compromise. English warfare was always tied to property and wealth. The resources needed to fight, horses, arms, provisions, remained under local control, and the Crown relied on Parliament's willingness to release funds. It was precisely why figures like Sir John Smythe caused alarm when they tried to interfere with local musters. The trained bands were the only real military force available, and they represented the fragile bridge between national strategy and local autonomy. At heart, England remained a peaceable country. Its people valued a quiet countryside more than military glory, and after surviving the religious wars of the 16th century, most were content to avoid further entanglements. This suited James I, who preferred peace, but clashed with Charles I, who dreamed of military ventures and believed force could solve political and diplomatic disputes. His enthusiasm for war was out of step with a society that preferred peace, and by the 1620s and 1630s, the gap between the king's ambitions and his subjects' desires had become impossible to bridge. By 1642, England still had no clear legal system for raising an army, a striking sign of how little the country had prepared itself for conflict. Unlike continental states with standing forces or large mercenary networks, neither king nor parliament could muster thousands of professional troops. The men around Charles at Whitehall numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. So fragile was England's military culture that a mere £200 spent on soldiers could create a national panic. In truth, the country had won itself security not by becoming strong in arms, but by avoiding the need for them, an approach that worked until civil war forced the issue. English warfare was usually defensive in nature. The kingdom rarely raised large armies unless danger loomed, and resources were directed to war only in proportion to the threat. This meant that England's greatest military achievements often came during moments of crisis. The years between 1588 and 1603, when the nation was stretched to its limits, saw its most impressive triumphs. By contrast, Henry VIII could field large armies in the 1540s because he did not carry the burden of maintaining them long-term. His campaigns relied heavily on mercenaries, contractors, and the resources of noblemen. England had wealth, manpower, and a capable royal household, but much depended on the will and the whims of the monarch at the center. Under Somerset, military organization was used with skill, but without strong central leadership, victories quickly faded, as seen in Scotland. Elizabeth faced a different problem. Her forces in Ireland were smaller than continental armies, but the Irish wars drained her kingdom with astonishing expense and bloodshed. Ironically, England often had the money for great armies when it least needed them. But when the danger was greatest, she had to strain every nerve to gather the means to fight. Much of the strength came not from London, but from the shires. Local communities bore the heaviest burdens of recruitment, supply, and defense, and although they often acted grudgingly or in their own way, the Queen still managed to raise soldiers, arms, and equipment. Victory in Ireland, the repulse of Spain, and the experience gained on the continent were made possible not by a centralized military machine, but by the stubborn efforts of local communities and private enterprise. Elizabeth's reputation for parsimony, her obsession with cost, was not entirely undeserved, but it was also not entirely unfair. War was expensive. Subsidies from Parliament were shrinking in value due to inflation, and she had little choice but to balance strategy with finance. The size and deployment of armies often depended less on her wishes than on the cooperation of Parliament and the localities. Even when seaborne expeditions like Cadiz in 1596 carried a piratical edge, it was more out of financial necessity than royal unwillingness to spend. In reality, the Queen's military strategy was constantly shaped by politics, Parliament, and the shires. England's military development in this period can be compared to the rise of commerce and industry. Just as the commercial and later industrial revolutions owed much to individuals rather than state planning, so did England's art of war. Captains who had served in Europe wrote treatises, entrepreneurs built cannon, and local officials organized supplies. Success came not from bureaucracy, but from individual initiative. Mayors, justices, deputy lieutenants, and even ordinary soldiers. The history of English warfare was, above all, a story of individuals doing their duty under difficult circumstances. At Kinsale, sentries literally froze at their posts rather than abandon their duty. Such examples remind us that courage, endurance, and morale mattered as much as new weapons or fresh tactics. Critics then and later often dismissed English military capacity as weak. They pointed out that England's greatest victories on the continent, whether in 1513, 1544, or the 1590s, were usually achieved in cooperation with experienced European allies. Yet allies often proved more of a hindrance than a help. And while England's wars in France sometimes ended poorly, her soldiers earned respect at Ostend, standing shoulder to shoulder with Europe's finest. At home, victories in Scotland and the decisive win at Kinsale proved that even against unconventional Celtic warfare, arguably a greater challenge than set-piece battles in Europe, England could prevail. Before Charles I, debates about the military mostly revolved around cost and scale. The monarch was expected to defend the realm, Parliament to provide support. But with Charles, the very figure meant to protect the kingdom became, in the eyes of many, its greatest danger. For the first time since the 15th century, the specter of civil war, long thought unthinkable, returned. England's trained bands, built up under the Tudors and Stuarts to defend against foreign threats, now faced the possibility of being turned against their own countrymen. The fear that the king might use these forces to dissolve Parliament by violence made the danger terrifyingly real. That fear only grew with the so-called army plots and the eruption of rebellion in Ireland. In a monarchy spanning 3 kingdoms, military forces from one realm could be used to subdue another. This was not new. Philip II had done the same with Spanish and German troops in the Netherlands. But the Bishops' Wars of 1639–40 gave the issue a new intensity. Traditionally, sending an army against the Scots was nothing unusual, but in the fractured religious climate of the Reformation, it carried alarming implications. Elizabethan wars had been fought against Catholicism. Now Charles's campaign struck directly at Protestant Scotland. Worse still, the king's lack of money forced him to consider foreign mercenaries, even Catholic troops, to suppress his own Protestant subjects. Parliament, seeing itself as the guardian of the realm, resisted fiercely. By 1641, the tension had become unbearable. The First Army Plot convinced John Pym and his allies that Charles would use force to crush Parliament. A second plot that summer aimed at marching English troops raised for Ireland back into London to intimidate MPs and seize the Tower. Just days later, news of the Irish Rebellion arrived. Proof that military power, left unchecked, could tear the kingdoms apart. From this crisis came the Militia Ordinance of 1642, transferring control of the trained bands to Parliament. What had once been the Crown's shield against Catholic Europe was now directed inward, toward the king himself. London played a decisive role in this shift. The city, with its militia drilled in the artillery garden, became the center of Parliament's military strength. What had been an amateur force of 6,000 men was expanded and trained into an effective army of 8,000. By the summer of 1642, Parliament, allied with the Corporation of London, controlled roughly 20,000 troops, enough to challenge the king directly. For Charles, this was an unthinkable reversal. His mismanagement of the militia had allowed Parliament to seize the very instrument of power he needed. the clash over the control of arms culminated dramatically in April 1642, when Sir John Hotham barred the gates of Hull to Charles himself, denying him access to the arsenal. Here, the constitutional struggle became a military one. Was resisting the king's personal orders treason, or loyalty to the law above the man? For Hotham's soldiers, the answer was far from clear. Some, like young William Lonsdale and Richard Yeadon, felt trapped, pressed into rebellion against their sovereign and desperate to escape. To many contemporaries, this was the moment English warfare turned against itself. Weapons meant to defend the kingdom from foreign invasion were now aimed at fellow Englishmen. As Lord Paget put it when he abandoned Parliament for the king, he had fought for reform and the common good. But when he saw a preparation of arms against the king under the shadow of loyalty, he chose conscience over faction. At York, many of the nobility rallied around Charles I, swearing to defend both the king and his rights against Parliament's new militia ordinance. Yet not everyone shared their loyalty. Sir John Hotham's dramatic decision to deny Charles entry to Hull's magazine was rooted in his past. Having served in the Protestant cause during the 30 Years' War, possibly even at the Battle of White Mountain, Hotham saw himself as a guardian against Catholic influence. His earlier secret talks with the Scots only reinforced Charles's suspicion that Hotham's true sympathies lay with militant Protestantism. For men like him, defending England meant looking far beyond its shores, for the popish threat seemed everywhere. By the 1640s, the language of defending the realm was no longer just about guarding coasts. It meant preserving Protestant religion and the state itself, even if that meant opposing the king. The Irish Rebellion in 1641 made these fears real. News of atrocities hardened Parliament's resolve, convincing many that survival itself, the law of nature, justified extraordinary measures. If Charles would not settle control of the militia, then Parliament must. In this climate, Parliament began issuing arms on its own authority, thousands of muskets, cavalry gear, and stores of powder. Charles countered with his own orders, furious at Parliament's presumption to draw weapons from the royal arsenal. Soon the struggle for control of guns and fortresses spread across the country. Hull became a flashpoint, but similar contests unfolded in towns and counties, with rival officials seizing or intercepting war supplies, each side claiming to act in the true spirit of English law. War, once something England had largely waged abroad, was now turning inward. Ireland had long been the spark for larger conflicts, both in Elizabeth's reign and again under Charles. Supporting the Dutch had drawn England into confrontation with Spain. Ireland's rebellion dragged the country into civil war. By 1642, observers described the kingdom's descent into conflict in almost apocalyptic terms. Reports of strange omens, villagers near Knaresborough claiming to see devils drilling with pikes, captured the sense of dread. Continental voices echoed the same message. England could no longer escape the bloody purging that had already engulfed Europe. That purging began in earnest after 1641. Early skirmishes at Manchester, Marshall's Elm, Babylon Hill, and Powick Bridge saw Englishmen clash with neighbors and former comrades. By October, the first major battle of the Civil War erupted at Edgehill. There, veterans of continental campaigns, men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the Protestant cause, now commanded rival armies. Sir Jacob Astley led the king's infantry. Facing him was the Earl of Essex with Parliament's men. The scale of the bloodshed was shocking, but the quality of the fighting made one thing clear. England had no shortage of men who knew how to wage war. The tragedy was not that the English lacked skill, but that this hard-earned expertise was now turned against each other. For nearly a century, strategy had focused on keeping foreign enemies from English soil. By 1642, England had absorbed the full force of Europe's military revolution, not by defending against outsiders, but by fighting itself.